Hey guys, tonight we slip past the torchlit guards, through a whispering hallway heavy with velvet drapes, and into the rooms where history has politely looked away for centuries. The tapestries here are thick enough to swallow sound, the air perfumed with spiced wine and beeswax, and the floor muffled beneath thick Persian rugs. You probably won't survive this, not because of danger, but because you might drown in the absurd, decadent detail of what you are about to witness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, tell me your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little nighttime corner of history reaches. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand behind the curtains of a medieval royal bedchamber, not as a servant, not as a guard, but as something stranger, a witness to a secret the kingdom would never print in its annals. The king himself is here, though you would not know it from his attire. No crown, no robes, just a deep crimson tunic loose at the throat, slippers of soft leather, and a faint smudge of ink on his fingers from the day's charters. It's oddly intimate to see a ruler without the weight of ceremony on his shoulders. You can almost imagine he might be just a man until the layers of ritual begin. The first oddity is the silence, not the absence of noise, but the deliberate, rehearsed stillness. In this court, privacy was never truly private. Trusted chamberlains, sworn to secrecy, stood in the shadows, ready to record or report. Historians still argue whether this was for security, superstition, or a peculiar royal fixation on being remembered in every aspect. The official version? To ensure the king's honor was preserved. The unofficial one whispered among the laundresses? He wanted his life, all of it, turned into a living legend. And so, behind these velvet curtains, a ritual unfolded. Before the king even approached his bed, a herald, yes, a herald announced the closing of the royal day. In a voice as steady as the cathedral bells, the herald recited the king's victories, petitions granted, enemies routed, and the blessings supposedly secured from heaven. This was not a bedtime prayer. This was branding. The king's image, reinforced nightly for his closest circle, so even the most private moment became an extension of statecraft. You might think this would kill any romantic atmosphere, and you would be right unless you considered the strangeness of power itself. The king was not here to woo with flowers or poetry. He was here to stage, manage desire the way he stage, manage diplomacy. One step to the right and he was lit by candle clusters designed to soften every line of his face. The flicker made the gold threads in his tunic catch like sun on water. He was not courting a lover. He was curating an audience, even if the audience was just one person. Here is where the mainstream fact drops in. Medieval kings' bedchambers were not solely for sleeping. They were extensions of the throne room, places where politics and pleasure tangled like ivy. The idea of a wholly private royal night is a modern fantasy. Back then, intimacy could be a performance, a message, a negotiation. Even the arrangement of pillows had a language. 3 stacked meant comfort. 2 at angles? That was for serious discussion. 1 at the foot of the bed? The meaning of that one, my friend, was never written down. Now, about the quirky tidbit. This particular king believed that the color of the drapery determined the tone of the night. Red meant passion, yes, but green meant renewal, gold meant triumph, and blue, his personal favorite, meant divine blessing. You can imagine the head valet's face on evenings when the wrong set of curtains was hung. A misplaced swath of fabric could have derailed the whole mood. Somewhere in the castle, an exhausted servant was probably muttering prayers to the saints of upholstery. The night you are peeking in on now has red curtains, heavy as theatre backdrops. The candlelight makes them seem almost alive, rippling like molten wine. The king moves through the space slowly, deliberately, as though each step toward the bed is part of a dance no one else quite understands. His attendants melt away, their work done, leaving him in a pool of gold light. He sits, not lying down yet, as though savoring the anticipation of stillness. The bed itself is absurd. It's less a piece of furniture than a stage. complete with a raised platform, carved posts twisted into vines, and a canopy embroidered with scenes from mythology, carefully chosen ones, of course, where kings and gods were interchangeable. This was not subtle. Every inch of the room was telling a story, and the story was, here sleeps a man chosen by heaven, adored by the earth, and envied by both. What strikes you most is the absence of spontaneity. You think of modern notions of intimacy, unplanned, improvised, private. This is the opposite. Here, intimacy is architecture. Every cushion, every flicker of candlelight, every angle of the king's profile as he turns toward his companion is planned. And yet, within that rigid frame, something human flickers. A laugh, low and unguarded, escapes him. He reaches for a goblet of spiced wine, not because it is part of the performance, but because his throat is dry. That tiny, unplanned moment feels more intimate than all the velvet in the world. And then you remember the strangest part. This was normal, for him. Night after night, behind curtains thicker than the winter tapestries in the great hall, this dance of image and desire played out. The details might change, the curtain color, the candle arrangement, the whispered words, but the structure remained the same. It was the king's way of making even pleasure into an active state. Historians still argue whether he enjoyed this, or if it was simply another duty, no different from inspecting fortifications or hosting foreign envoys. Was the velvet-draped secrecy for his own indulgence? Or was it a way to ensure that no moment of his life escaped the control of the crown? We will never know for certain. All we can do is peek from the shadows, breathe in the scent of warm beeswax and burning cedar, and watch as the king, half man, half myth, slips into the kind of night that would never make it into the history books. You wake the next evening to the hum of distant trumpets. Not the triumphant blare that greets armies returning from war, but a softer, almost mischievous fanfare. The king's private hall is alive with murmurs, and you soon realize tonight is no ordinary gathering. You're about to witness what the court politely calls the fertility pageant. This was a spectacle that blurred the lines between royal duty and theatre, in a time when dynasties could collapse for want of an heir. Proving virility wasn't just personal, it was political. And so, instead of quietly retiring to a private chamber, some kings staged what can only be described as a courtly fertility performance. It wasn't as crude as you might imagine, but it wasn't exactly subtle either. The hall is dressed for the occasion. Gold banners threaded with vine motifs hang from the rafters, the floor sprinkled with fresh petals that stick slightly to your shoes. At the center, an elevated dais has been transformed into something between a banquet table and an altar. Platters of figs, pomegranates, and honeycomb gleam under candlelight, each fruit chosen for its symbolism of abundance and life. A court poet stands ready with a scroll, his voice oiled for reciting verses about blooming orchards and swelling rivers, metaphors so obvious even the stable boys are smirking in the back. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In certain European courts, royal consummations were at least semi-public events, attended by witnesses to guarantee that marriage contracts were fulfilled and alliances sealed. It sounds invasive now, but then it was considered a safeguard both for the legitimacy of heirs and the honor of the bride. You might think of it as a peculiar mix of legal document and live performance. Tonight's version, however, has been shaped by the king's flair for pageantry. Before anything remotely intimate happens, the pageant begins with a ritual parade of virtues. The queen, radiant in white silk, processes slowly through the hall, followed by ladies in waiting dressed as allegorical figures. Fertility carries a cornucopia. Health wears a crown of laurel. Prosperity jingles a pouch of gold coins. You suspect one of them might actually be holding real money, judging by the way a few of the guards eye her. Now for the quirky tidbit. This king insisted that the entire pageant be timed to the exact moment the castle's astrologer deemed most auspicious for conception. This meant the entire court might be kept waiting for hours while the astrologer tracked the position of Venus and Mars. On one infamous night, the pageant began so late that the candles burned down halfway through, forcing a hurried change to lanterns, and giving the whole thing a dim, conspiratorial glow. The servants called it the night of the sleepy air. The herald announces the final blessing, and a bishop steps forward not with a sermon, but with a short, highly symbolic prayer for fruitfulness. The king, already dressed in embroidered nightclothes far finer than most people's wedding garments, takes the queen's hand. There's a kind of theatrical gravity in his movements, a sense that he knows every eye is upon him. And here's the part that's stranger still. The fertility was as much for morale as it was for biology. The court needed to believe in the inevitability of heirs, in the strength of the royal body. These pageants reassured not just the noble families, but the visiting envoys who would carry tales back to foreign courts. You slipped to the edge of the dais, far enough to avoid notice, close enough to catch the murmur of the poet's closing lines. His voice is soft now, meant only for those closest to the royal couple. The river swells, the grain rises, the earth takes seed. Heavy-handed? Absolutely. But in a time before modern medicine, such imagery was a kind of magic, woven into the night like a charm. As the court disperses, you catch a moment fleeting, but revealing. The king, free from the gaze of most of the audience, leans toward the queen and says something that makes her laugh. A quick, bright sound that breaks the ritual's heavy formality. It is almost jarring, like a child's giggle in a cathedral. And for that instant, you see them not as king and queen, but as two people caught between duty and desire, between myth and mundane reality. Historians still argue whether these pageants actually improved chances of conception, or whether they were nothing more than elaborate propaganda. What is certain is that they left an indelible image in the minds of those who attended. Even decades later, guests would recall the color of the queen's gown, the scent of crushed petals underfoot, and the strange, solemn thrill of watching the making of a dynasty as if it were a staged play. And so, you leave the hall, petals sticking to your cloak, wondering if the future heir's birth, if it comes, will be credited to celestial alignment, the poet's verse, or simply the quiet, unrecorded human moments that followed after the court had gone to bed. The next night finds you drifting into the royal apothecary's chamber, a place that smells like someone boiled a spice market and a barnyard in the same pot. Here is where you learn about the king's infamous peacock feather potions. Rows of glass jars line the shelves, each containing some mystery of medieval medicine: powdered antler, dried rose hips, ambergris, and sitting in pride of place bundles of iridescent peacock feathers. The court's chief alchemist, a man whose beard appears to have more volume than his robes, claims these feathers, when steeped in a particular blend of wine, honey, and other secret substances, could awaken passions even in the most world-weary monarch. Whether the secret substances included anything more potent than cinnamon is still up for debate. Mainstream historical fact first. Many medieval courts genuinely believed in aphrodisiacs made from exotic or visually impressive ingredients. From powdered gemstones to rare spices brought along treacherous trade routes, the rarer the ingredient, the more magical it was presumed to be. In some cases, the potency was judged less on actual effect and more on the cost and difficulty of obtaining it. But this king took the tradition into absurd territory. The quirky tidbit? He insisted that the feathers could only be plucked from a living peacock under the light of a waxing moon, while a poem was being recited. The poem, naturally, was one he had commissioned himself, extolling the virtues of regal beauty and eternal youth. Imagine being the poor apprentice tasked with holding the bird still, while your master mumbled rhyming couplets about destiny and desire. Tonight, the king is here in person, not just to receive his potion but to watch its making. He stands beside the workbench like a child in a sweet shop, eyes bright with anticipation. The alchemist moves with ceremonial precision, feathers trimmed, their barbs crushed into a powder that shimmers faintly in the lamplight, honey drizzled into a clay pot, wine poured in a slow, deliberate stream. The smell is strangely appealing, sweet, spiced, with a faint metallic tang from the bronze stirrer. The king leans in, inhaling deeply, then takes the cup in both hands. He sips, closing his eyes in exaggerated appreciation. Around you, courtiers nod and smile, as if each taste is a victory for the realm. No one dares point out that the main effect so far seems to be sticky lips. And here's the thing. The real magic was never in the ingredients. It was in the theatre. The making of the potion was a performance designed to remind everyone present that the king's desires, and thus his power, were being tended to with the same care as his armies or his treasury. In a court obsessed with symbols, a peacock feather potion wasn't a frivolity. It was a statement. The scholarly debate? Historians still argue whether the king truly believed in the potion's effects or whether he simply enjoyed the spectacle. Some point to letters in which he describes a night like a summer storm after drinking it. Others suspect he was indulging in a private joke, keeping the court dancing to his tune by pretending the potion mattered. You watch as the last dregs are drained and the alchemist receives a ring from the king's own finger, a reward for services to the vitality of the crown. The courtiers clap politely. The peacock in the corner looks vaguely offended, and the king departs, trailing the faint scent of honeyed wine. As you follow, you think about the absurdity of it all. Here was a man whose armies could decide the fate of kingdoms, yet he placed equal ceremony on sipping a concoction of feathers and spices. You can't decide if it's charming, ridiculous, or both. Either way, the moment stays with you, the shimmer of the crushed feather, the heat of the spiced wine, the way power can sometimes taste as sweet and fleeting as honey on the tongue. You slip back into the bedchamber at a quieter hour and notice something you missed before. 2 small stools wait in the shadow near the canopy posts, and on each stool rests a writing kit. Not prayer books, not psalters, pens and wax tablets. Tonight you learn that the king's privacy has auditors. Trusted men of the bedchamber hover like kindly ghosts, trained to see everything and to say almost nothing. You hear the soft scratch of a quill and realize someone is literally itemizing the atmosphere. Candle clusters counted, incense sticks measured, pillows fluffed and rotated like sacred objects. If you ever thought romance was spontaneous, the royal household would like to offer you a ledger. Mainstream historical fact glides in as gently as the night breeze through the mullioned window. Medieval monarchs kept intimate households staffed by chamberlains, grooms of the bedchamber, and valets of the body. These attendants controlled access, arranged the room, laid out nightclothes, and sometimes witnessed key rituals tied to marriage and succession. They kept accounts for linens and perfumes, logged deliveries, and reported on the smooth running of the royal night. In some courts, their notes became household books that outlived the kings they served. The crown might forget a minor treaty, but it never forgot which lavender oil came from Provence. A familiar scent lingers. Honeyed wine. You remember the peacock feather potion and smile at the thought of a scribe writing, "Spirits administered, morale elevated with a straight face." The inspectors do not drink. They observe. One tilts a candle to check the wick heights and murmurs that the 5th candle is burning too fast. Another kneels to smooth the rug's edge so the king's bare foot will encounter no crease that could spoil the mood. If it seems fussy, it is. But this fussy world protects the monarch from unpleasant surprises, including rebellious floorboards. The first light joke tiptoes in. Somewhere, an apprentice has probably been punished for a squeaky hinge that ruined a royal rhythm. The door opens with priestly silence. The bed inspectors dip their heads, then pass into a side alcove that overlooks the chamber through a lattice. From there they will witness only what they must. Their job is not voyeurism. It is testimony. The kingdom needs heirs, and the great families require assurance that a marriage has been consummated. The inspectors do not narrate. They confirm. Think of it like a medieval blue checkmark. Verified by appointment to the crown. One of the men, older than the rest, sets out the wax tablets. Quirky tidbit incoming. This court has a custom of rating. Quiet. Not quality. Quiet. The belief runs that a serene bedchamber breeds serene heirs. So the senior inspector records the ambient hush in tiny symbols that look like curled ferns. 1 fern means a hallway whisper. 2 means wind against the shutters. 3 ferns means a lute somewhere in the tower playing a tune so tender it would make even the castle cats behave. The scale is unofficial, but everyone treats it like scripture. A 4-fern night once prompted the master of revels to relocate a whole rehearsal because the future needs calm air. Across the room, a valet checks the sheets with a seriousness usually reserved for treaties. His fingers know linen the way falconers know feathers. He notes the thread count in household code. A second valet warms a small brick and wraps it in cloth to slip near the king's feet. It is a common trick, but it feels like love disguised as logistics. Even kings get cold toes. The candlelight skates over carved bedposts where vines climb and doves nest. You trace a vine with your eyes and feel sleep tug at you, as if the carving were a lullaby you could touch. The king enters. He looks less theatrical than on the night of the pageant, and more like a tired man who has carried a country all day. He glances toward the lattice. It is not resentment you see on his face. It is resignation mixed with a flicker of relief. The inspectors are not there to judge him. They are there to shoulder the burden of proof. A nod, the smallest possible, passes between king and witness. The room deepens into quiet. Historians still argue whether these nightly reports were intimate chronicle or simple logistics. Some say nothing beyond linens, candles, and comings and goings was ever written. Others point to suggestive margins in household books where a discreet hand drew tiny stars on nights of significance. A star might mean auspicious timing. It might mean a royal quarrel resolved. Or it might mean the scribe spilled ink and decided to make art. The debate is lively, the evidence stubbornly shy. You watch the older inspector press his stylus into the wax and mark 2 symbols, one for timing, one for witnesses present. He also slides a folded parchment into a small coffer by the bed. That coffer is for tokens, the polite term for any item that proves what the kingdom needs proved. A ribbon, a torn thread, a blessing scrawled by a chaplain with handwriting like broken ice. You feel the weight of that coffer the way you feel the weight of a secret between friends. The second light joke peeks around the canopy. A page in the corridor sneezes, tries to turn the sneeze into a cough, then into a throat clearing that somehow sounds like a lute string snapping. 3 heads swivel toward the door with the speed of hawks. The page will learn what every servant learns. In this castle, the nose is a political actor. There is a kindness in the inspector's posture that takes you by surprise. Their presence is ceremonial, yes, but beneath ceremony you sense a long companionship with the king. One of them once dressed him for his first tournament. Another steadied him on a morning when grief clawed his throat. Tonight they steady the story. Tomorrow, if a rumor rises like smoke from a kitchen fire, they will blow it out with facts. You think of how modern you feel when you talk about privacy, how you guard your phone like a dragon guards gold. Then you think of this king, who trades privacy for legitimacy. He lets witnesses stand near his knight so his children will inherit a crown without whispers. Power is a hard pillow. He makes it softer by filling it with certainty. A low bell rings from the chapel. Not a summons. A blessing to mark the hour. The inspectors write the time down because the astrologer will want to cross-check his charts. If the stars said prosperity was more likely after midnight, the household will want to see if prosperity obeyed. You recall the astrologer's face on the night of the pageant, and imagine him right now, chewing a quill in joy or despair depending on where Venus wandered. Scholars still argue whether these celestial schedules were sincere belief or refined theatre, yet the schedules shaped the rhythm of the king's most private life. The room exhales. Somewhere a log settles in the hearth. The inspectors collect their tablets and perform a tiny ritual of closure. Each tablet is kissed with a blob of wax, each blob sealed with a ring that bears a device no one else is allowed to use. Later, the entries will be copied neatly into the household book by a clerk with patience and a spine like a question mark. The originals will rest in a locked chest that smells of cedar and old decisions. As you drift toward the corridor, you pass a linen press where the laundress has tucked a sprig of rosemary between folded sheets. You touch it and see her face in your mind. All quick hands and no-nonsense kindness. People imagine royal knights as theatrics spun from velvet and gold. They forget the rosemary. They forget the hands that make the world soft. The third light joke hovers at your mouth. If the kingdom ever collapses, it will be because the rosemary ran out and everyone got cranky. You reach the far end of the passage and look back. The lattice shows nothing now but a pattern of dark diamonds. The inspectors move away as quietly as shadows when the sun lifts. You think of the peacock feather potion, the fertility pageant, the velvet curtain codes, and you realize how the pieces fit. Desire here is not just a feeling, it is infrastructure. It is the bridge that carries the state from one generation to the next. And every bridge needs inspectors. You arrive in the great hall at dusk, the long tables already stripped of their benches. Tonight is the bride parade ritual, an event that manages to be both a marriage market and a public relations campaign. It is the kind of occasion where the king can demonstrate taste, authority, and the peculiar medieval talent for making romance feel like a jousting match without horses. From the dais, the view is a living tapestry. Nobles and foreign envoys gather on one side, murmuring in anticipation, while on the other side stands a row of young women, each dressed to dazzle. The candlelight catches on silk, pearls, and gold thread embroidery, until the whole scene seems painted rather than real. The king himself sits in an elaborate chair that is not quite a throne, more like a stage prop that signals, "I am in charge, but tonight is about selection, not decrees." Here's the mainstream historical fact. In some courts, the presentation of eligible brides was a formal affair, sometimes conducted in public as part of marriage negotiations. In regions where alliances were crucial, such displays were as much about politics as they were about personal preference. The women on display were not random. Each represented a family with wealth, influence, or military support to offer. And the quirky tidbit? This king added a twist. Before the official selection, each prospective bride had to present a gift that was both symbolic and personal. A carved ivory comb, a hand-woven sash, a jar of honey from her family's own hives. The king claimed it allowed him to see their character. Courtiers whispered. It allowed him to judge whether a future queen would be frugal, extravagant, or sly enough to charm an audience without saying a word. The ritual begins with the master of ceremonies calling each woman forward. They approach the king one by one, curtsying low, placing their gift into a velvet-lined box at his feet, and holding his gaze for precisely 3 heartbeats. Less is dangerous, too shy. More is dangerous, still too bold. You sense that this is less about romance than about performance under pressure, a skill every queen would need. The king greets each candidate with a few quiet words, though you notice his eyes flicker more to the crowd than to the woman in front of him. He is gauging the reactions, how her family holds themselves, whether foreign envoys whisper approval or skepticism. One girl's gift, a small silver mirror, prompts the faintest smile from him. You wonder if he's amused by the implication that he should be looking at himself rather than the line of brides. Light joke number 1 slips into your thoughts. The gift table looks so varied you half expect someone to present a well-trained chicken just to stand out. In fact, you suspect the poultry would be remembered long after the jewels. The parade continues, each woman introduced by name and lineage. The herald's voice turns the introductions into a kind of chant, weaving the kingdom's politics into the rhythm of the evening. You realize you could reconstruct half the noble family tree just by listening carefully. The king takes notes not on paper, but in the subtle shifts of his expression. A raised eyebrow here, a slight lean forward there. Historians still argue whether the king's final choice on nights like this was truly his own, or whether it was decided in smoky council rooms weeks beforehand. Some say the parade was pure theatre, the outcome already sealed. Others believe the king's personal whims sometimes overrode political logic, leading to matches that puzzled even his closest advisers. The hall fills with the scent of beeswax and rosewater as the last candidate steps forward. Her gift is a small carved box, plain on the outside but lined with embroidered silk within. The king opens it slowly, and something unreadable passes over his face. Is it admiration? Surprise? Only he knows. The box is closed again, placed beside him with a care that makes the crowd murmur. The second light joke lands as you imagine the castle gossip by morning. Did you see the way he touched the box? No one touches a box like that unless they're smitten or unless it's full of very good cheese. The evening winds down with a formal procession out of the hall. The women file away through one door, the envoys and nobles through another. The king remains seated, watching the last flickers of candlelight play over the now empty space. It strikes you that the parade is not just about finding a bride, it's about reminding everyone present that the king's choice, when it comes, will shape the kingdom's alliances for decades. As the servants begin clearing away petals from the rushes, you catch a fragment of conversation between two courtiers. One says the king will announce his choice by the next full moon. The other insists he already whispered it to his astrologer. Either way, the decision will ripple outward like a stone tossed into a still pond. Your last glimpse of the night is the king, alone at the dais, turning the plain carved box over in his hands. In that quiet moment, he looks less like a man conducting state business and more like someone who has just been handed a mystery and intends to solve it in his own time. Light joke number 3 drifts in as you leave. In this castle, even mysteries probably come with a ceremonial announcement and an official seal. The corridors are hushed tonight, but it's not the hush of sleep, it's the hush of anticipation. You follow the faint glow of oil lamps to a small audience chamber converted into something stranger, the stage for the king's saintly seduction trials. The name alone is a contradiction in silk. Imagine a man in ermine robes staging mock-holy encounters to justify his desires, as if piety and passion could share the same bed. Yet in this kingdom they do. The chamber is arranged like a chapel, benches on either side, a carved screen at the far end, candles clustered beneath an icon of a saint known for blessing unions. The saint's eyes, painted centuries ago, seem to follow everyone who enters. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval rulers often leaned heavily on religious imagery to legitimize personal choices, especially those that might otherwise seem improper. Royal marriages could be framed as divinely sanctioned, even when politics or personal whim were the true drivers. But this king? He pushed the concept further into theatrics. The quirky tidbit: once a season, he would hold a trial where potential companions, or occasionally his current queen, would appear before him in the guise of a saint or biblical figure. The goal was to act out scenes of divine testing or temptation. Sometimes the roles were reversed. He played the saint, they the penitent. At other times, he was the one being tested. These trials were public enough to involve select members of the court, but private enough that the church could pretend not to know. Tonight's trial begins with a reading from a psalter, delivered by a chaplain who clearly wishes he was somewhere else. The king, robed in white and gold, sits at the head of the chamber, a ring of gold thread stitched into the hem of his garment so the light catches it every time he moves. The first supplicant steps forward draped in a plain wool robe, a crown of herbs circling her hair. She carries a carved staff and walks with the solemnity of a holy pilgrim. Her task? To plead her case for entry into the kingdom of virtue the monarch is said to guard. The dialogue begins formally scripted phrases exchanged like pieces on a chessboard. But then, as always, the script phrase. She asks a question not written down. He answers with a joke that makes the front row of courtiers choke on their own silence. It is part performance, part test. Can she match his wit without breaking the holy frame? Light joke number 1 wanders through your head. Somewhere in the afterlife, the actual saint is probably raising an eyebrow and muttering, "This was not in the manual." The trial moves to the second phase. The king offers 3 temptations on a silver tray: a ruby ring, a vial of rose oil, and a key carved from bone. She must choose one, and her choice will reveal the truth of her soul. Of course, everyone present has their own theory about what each object means. The ruby might symbolize loyalty or vanity. The rose oil could mean tenderness or indulgence. The bone key, rumored to unlock a hidden coffer, might represent trust or curiosity. or simply very bad taste in jewelry. She picks the rose oil. The king leans forward, sniffing it theatrically before handing it back to her. A murmur runs through the room. Somewhere, wagers are being settled silently. The chaplain closes his book with a sigh you can hear from across the chamber. Historians still argue whether these trials were elaborate courting rituals, political allegories, or simply the king's own brand of entertainment. Supporters claimed they allowed him to gauge character in a setting where wit, poise, and symbolism mattered. Critics saw them as indulgent games that blurred the lines between church and bedchamber. The trial concludes, with the king rising from his seat, stepping down to stand beside the supplicant. They walk together to the icon, where he lays his hand on the saint's painted foot and murmurs a blessing that no one else can quite hear. The candles flicker, as if in agreement. Then he turns to the court and declares the trial worthy, dismissing everyone with a sweep of his hand. Light joke number 2. You can't help imagining the royal carpenter somewhere in the back, muttering, "If he keeps making people kneel here, I'm going to have to reinforce that saint's foot." As the crowd disperses, you notice the king and the woman speaking quietly in the corner. The air between them has shifted. It's no longer about symbols and roles. They stand closer than the performance required, their voices low enough that even the nearest attendant pretends not to hear. The rose oil glints in her hand, catching the last of the candlelight. Light joke number 3 is quick and sly. If the rose oil runs out by tomorrow, the apothecary is going to have a very good week. You step into the corridor, the hum of conversation behind you fading into the deeper quiet of the castle at night. You think of the saint's painted eyes, the tray of temptations, the way ritual can blur into something personal before anyone notices. Maybe that's the king's real skill, not just ruling, but turning ceremony into something that feels like a secret, even in a room full of witnesses. You drift toward the tiltyard after midnight and discover that the sanded lanes have been transformed. No pennants flap, no crowds roar, yet braziers burn with a slow, coppery glow that makes the lances stacked along the fence look like reeds in a moonlit marsh. Tonight the king hosts what his closest circle calls the midnight jousts. They are not contests of steel and shattered shields. They are competitions of charm, wit, and stamina staged with the same pomp as tournaments. Armor gives way to velvet, horses to whispers, but the stakes are no less royal. The marshal of the lists appears in a short cloak and carries a ledger instead of a trumpet. He reads the rules in a voice meant to travel, though only a handful of chosen witnesses stand by. Each round, 2 favored companions or courtiers face a gentle trial. A verse to improvise, a secret to decode, a dance to complete while balancing a goblet on the palm. The king, seated on a low platform where the judges usually sit, presides with eyes bright and tired, that familiar combination of duty and delight. You can still smell rosemary in the folds of the night air, as if the laundress has pressed calm into the wind. Here is the mainstream historical fact that undergirds the spectacle. Courts across medieval Europe loved structured games of courtly love. These were codified contests of verses, dances, and gallantries that let nobles compete for favor under a veil of refinement. The midnight jousts borrow that framework and nudge it toward the king's private theatre. It is not lechery dressed as sport. It is politics wrapped in poetry, because victory means nearness to the sovereign, and nearness means influence. The herald, who by day announces ambassadors and tax edicts, now announces challenges with a flourish. Round 1 begins with an exchange of metaphors. The theme is the heat of a September harvest. Contestants must praise the king and the season without once naming either. A lady compares the realm to a kiln where bread rises safely while wolves prowl outside. A young courtier speaks of a river fat with fish that leap into the net only at moonrise. The king chuckles, counting silently on his fingers when someone repeats an image already used. Light joke number 1 slips in as you picture the herald keeping a secret blacklist of tired metaphors where vines and swans have been banished for overuse. The second round is for quick feet. A musician plucks a tune so hushed you feel it more than hear it, a heartbeat of a melody. Contestants must circle the braziers without extinguishing the shallow flames. hands linked to attendants who walk backward and smile fixedly. It is a soft dance, a slow river around fire, and yet you can sense the real trial. Who can move in close company without clumsiness? Who can follow an unspoken lead? The king watches like a fencing master watches a bout, eyes tracking balance and breath. You think of the fertility pageant's measured steps, and the saintly trial's scripted turns. Everything in this court teaches movement under the gaze. Quirky tidbit time arrives with a wink. The king keeps a chest of tournament favours, not scarves or sleeves, but scented ribbons marked with tiny symbols cut into the silk. A lily means harmony. A star means daring. A thin, looping knot means discretion. He tosses these favours to the winners of each round with wrist flicks as precise as a lancer's couch. There is courtly lore about which symbol matters most. The servants say the knot trumps them all, since secrets make palaces breathe evenly. Between rounds, a page brings the king a small cup. Not peacock feather potion tonight. The apothecary has mixed a milder cordial of quince and clove. The king sips, smiles, and hands the cup to the herald to share. Small mercy for the voice that must purr till dawn. Light joke. Number 2. Tiptoes in as you imagine the apothecary, scribbling a label that reads cordial for competitive flirtation. Round 3 is where things sharpen. A riddle from the astrologer must be solved with a gesture rather than a word. He lifts a tablet etched with a circle of signs and asks, "When does loyalty grow longest?" A companion in blue steps forward, kneels, and places her hand in the earth of the tilt-yard, palm flat. The king's eyebrow climbs. Another contestant turns her ring so the stone faces inward and then bows. You do not know the answer the astrologer intends, but the king recognizes wit when he sees it. He taps his knee twice, the sign for a note in the ledger, praised for economy of motion. Historians still argue whether the midnight jousts were primarily a discreet audition for lovers or a schooling ground for influence. Some insist they settled private affections. Others claim they tested qualities a sovereign prized in counselors: quick invention, steady nerves, the ability to read a room lit only by embers. The evidence remains a mosaic of household books and letters that blush easily but refuse to confess outright. The 4th round has the hush of a chapel. Contestants take turns reciting a pledge of gentleness toward all within the king's peace. It is a vow shaped like down feathers and hidden claws. The winner will be the one who turns tenderness into command. A woman with a voice like warmed honey promises to speak truth to the king, but softly, so it lands like rain instead of hail. The king's mouth quirks. You remember the bed inspector's quiet rating ferns and think the night has grown at least a 2-fern calm. A small interruption arrives, comic as a stagehand tripping on a curtain. A stable cat strolls across the sand, tail high, and sits magnificently in the exact center of the lists. Every head turns. The marshal coughs. The herald's parchment flutters. Light joke number 3 slides into place. Somewhere a scribe will record that the 4th round was won by a creature with perfect balance and absolute disregard for protocol. When the cat finally chooses to leave, the last round begins. It is called the Lance of Patience. A silver pole rests on shallow pegs above the sand, and the contestants must lower it together, fingertips only, without letting it wobble. Too fast, and it bounces. Too slow, and the braziers sputter as if bored. You can feel the rooms of the castle holding their breath. Down goes the silver line, down like a river levee in a gentle flood, down to the sand where it touches with a sound like a sigh. Only one pair manages it clean. The king rises and tosses them each a favour bearing the knot. He does not declare champions with fanfare. He stands before the small company and speaks in the tone he uses to accept tribute from distant towns. Softer now, more human. He thanks them for grace, for games that kept words sweet and hearts steady in a year of rough harvests and sharp letters from abroad. This is the layer beneath the play. The kingdom needs rest even when it cannot sleep. The midnight jousts are how the court pretends to rest while practicing attention. You think of yesterday's saint and her tray of temptations. You think of the peacock feather shimmer and the velvet curtains that spoke in colours. The castle repeats itself with variation, like plainsong, never identical, always familiar. And within that repetition, the king finds what he needs most, a rhythm that makes power less jagged at the edges. As the braziers dwindle, the marshal closes his ledger with a soft thud. He will add the notes to the household book in the morning. Who moved lightly, who laughed at the right moment, who steadied a friend when the silver pole trembled. No scandal. Just the record of a night where desire wore manners and ambition learned to bow. You follow the hush back into the corridors. Somewhere the laundress is tucking rosemary between sheets and the astrologer is arguing with the clocks. The inspectors sleep with their wax tablets close. In the apothecary, a cat that looks suspiciously like tonight's champion curls on a pile of folded towels like a furry seal of approval. The kingdom breathes. The king practices patience. The knight, like a careful judge, declares the matter settled until next time. The next evening, the smell of incense draws you toward a wing of the castle you've never explored. The corridors grow narrower, the torches dimmer, until you step into a small, vaulted chamber, lit only by pools of gold light. Here, the king keeps his cloistered confession games, private encounters that pretend to be sacred, but are really elaborate seduction role-plays dressed in the trappings of piety. The room itself could pass for a monastic cell, though it is twice the size and far too sumptuous. A carved wooden screen divides the space into two halves, pierced by an ornate lattice. Cushions are arranged on each side of the lattice, and a single kneeler faces it directly. On the king's side, you glimpse a chair padded in crimson velvet, tall enough to cast him in silhouette if the light is right. On the other side, the kneeler is draped in white linen, an embroidered cross just visible at its center. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The medieval world was steeped in the language of confession, penance, and spiritual guidance. In courts that claimed divine sanction, even private intimacy could be cloaked in religious overtones. Some rulers staged quasi-religious encounters to frame their personal choices as guided by virtue rather than whim. This king takes that idea and gives it a theatrical twist. The quirky tidbit. Each confession game begins with the ringing of a small handbell carved from bone, said to have belonged to a hermit saint. The bell's tone is deep and oddly resonant, meant to signal that the evening's roles have begun. Whoever steps onto the other side of the lattice must confess a sin or temptation, fictional or real, while the king responds as confessor, saint, or occasionally penitent himself. Tonight's guest wears a hooded cloak of pale grey, the fabric heavy with the scent of frankincense. She kneels without hesitation, her hands folded loosely, posture poised. When she speaks, her voice is low and careful, offering the first confession, a dream in which she wandered into a walled garden and stole a fruit from the king's own tree. The king's reply is measured, his tone steeped in mock gravity. To take what is mine is theft, he says, but to return it in sweetness is virtue. Light joke number 1 stirs in your mind. Somewhere in the castle orchard, an actual gardener is wondering why the king's fruit trees are getting dragged into parables. The confession continues with an exchange of layered metaphors, temptation as wind, desire as drought, forgiveness as rain. Each time she pauses, the king leans slightly forward, his voice dipping lower, as though urging her to linger. The ritual is slow, hypnotic, and meant to keep the conversation balanced between the holy and the suggestive, without toppling into either. Then comes the second act of the game. The king presents a small object through the lattice, a token of penance or absolution. Tonight, it is a strip of silk embroidered with gold thread in the pattern of interlocking vines. He tells her she must carry it for 3 nights and return it only if she dreams again of the garden. She takes it with a slight bow of her head, fingers brushing his briefly through the carved wood. The contact is fleeting, but in this setting, fleeting contact is the point. Historians still argue whether these confession games were purely performative, a private screening ritual for companionship, or a genuine attempt to frame passion in moral terms. Some scholars see them as proof of the king's obsession with symbolism. Others see them as a subtle rebellion against the rigid lines between sacred and profane. The king rings the bone bell once more, signaling the end of the role play. The woman rises, bows deeply, and slips out through a side door. The room remains scented with frankincense and candle wax, and for a moment, the lattice looks less like a barrier and more like a carefully curated distance enough to keep desire heightened, never fully resolved. Light joke number 2 lands softly. If the church ever did find out about these games, they'd probably demand royalties for brand use. The king lingers a moment, fingertips resting on the lattice, as though memorizing the feel of the carved wood. Then he draws the curtain across it, erasing the view. Attendants step in silently to gather the cushions and snuff the candles, moving with the reverence of altar boys breaking down a chapel after Mass. You realize that this, too, is part of the act, the closing of the sanctuary, to keep the illusion intact until the next time. As you turn to leave, you hear the faint chime of the bell again. The king is alone now, ringing it for himself. Whether it's a summons for another guest or just the echo of the ritual, you can't tell. Light joke number 3 drifts through your thoughts. If he keeps ringing it without company, someone's going to mistake it for a late-night fire drill. You walk back into the main corridor, the air cooler, less scented, but the rhythm of the confession still in your ears. The king's skill lies not in the act itself, but in holding everyone guest, witness, and even himself inside the boundaries of the game until they feel real. And in this castle, the line between game and truth is so thin you could trace it with a fingertip, if only you dared. By the time the moon is high, the castle's great gate creaks open to admit a caravan from far beyond the horizon. Lanterns swing from the axles, casting swaying halos of light over crates bound in rope and silk stitched with alien symbols. This is the night of exotic lover imports, a practice as pragmatic as it is theatrical. According to the customs of the time, royal courts often sought companionship or political leverage by bringing individuals from distant lands into the orbit of the throne. These arrivals were rarely random. They were chosen for beauty, charm, or connections that could weave subtle ties between kingdoms. Sometimes they came with the blessing of their own rulers, sometimes under the careful disguise of a gift or retinue member. One unusual footnote to this court's version: the king insisted on meeting these arrivals not in the throne room, but in a specially decorated salon meant to evoke their homeland. If a companion hailed from the spice ports, the air would be thick with cinnamon and cardamom. If from the northern highlands, the room would be cooled and dressed in white furs. The idea, he claimed, was to make them feel at ease, but the courtiers joked it was simply his way of testing how closely they paid attention to their surroundings. Tonight's newcomer steps down from the caravan dressed in indigo robes, embroidered with gold crescents. She carries herself with the stillness of a hawk in the air, and her eyes scan the courtyard without any flicker of hesitation. The king descends from the steps to greet her, not with a kiss or bow, but by presenting a small lacquered box inlaid with pearls. She opens it to find a fragment of amber, warm from his palm. The gift is a silent promise. Welcome, but also watched. The audience moves inside, where the salon has been transformed into a facsimile of her coastal city. Nets hang between carved pillars, filled with shells polished smooth by tide and time. A brazier smoulders with resin that smells faintly of salt and citrus. It's an almost perfect imitation, though you spot one detail out of place, a woven mat patterned in the style of a region far to the south. Whether that's an oversight or a deliberate test, you cannot tell. Some experts maintain that such elaborate settings were part of a broader diplomatic theatre, blurring the lines between alliance building and personal indulgence. Others suggest the king simply delighted in curating miniature worlds within his castle, using each encounter as an excuse to add another jewel to his collection of experiences. A small but telling oddity tonight. The king has arranged a game for his guest. Courtiers are invited to bring her a token from the market stalls set up along one wall. Each token must be presented with a riddle in her native tongue. The riddles have been carefully coached, but the delivery is shaky. Half the courtiers struggle with the unfamiliar sounds, and one accidentally asks for a goat with 3 fathers, instead of a road with 3 turns. The king laughs, genuinely, and you sense the tension in the room ease. Light joke number 1 tiptoes into your thoughts. Somewhere in the kitchens, a cook is probably wondering if they should start preparing goat stew just in case. The evening ends with music. A trio of lutanists pluck a melody. The guest seems to recognize. Her lips move along with the tune, though no sound escapes. The king watches closely, leaning into each note as though he could read the song's meaning in her expression. When the final chord fades, she bows her head slightly, not to the musicians but to him. Debate continues among researchers about whether these imported companions wielded real influence or were simply the living equivalents of rare treasures in a cabinet. The written records are polite, vague, and maddeningly incomplete. Still, the care in staging nights like this suggests the king saw them as more than ornaments. He saw them as pieces in the long game of power, each with the potential to shift the board. Light joke number 2 drifts through. If chess pieces smelled this good, no one would ever finish a game. As the salon empties, the guest lingers by the nets, tracing her fingers over the shells. The king steps beside her, says something you cannot hear, and she smiles, not a court smile, but one that feels like the first real moment of the night. They walk out together, the scent of salt and resin following them down the corridor, as if the sea itself had slipped quietly into the castle. Light joke number 3 follows you out. The next morning, the astrologer will probably claim the tides have shifted because of maritime energies in the royal wing. The moment you cross the threshold of the king's private apartments tonight, the air feels different, thicker, more deliberate. Every breath is laced with musk, sandalwood, and a faint sweetness that clings to your tongue. This is the scented chamber, a place where fragrance itself is a weapon, a lure, and a declaration. Surviving accounts from the era reveal that medieval royalty treated perfume not as a luxury, but as a tool of influence. Certain scents were believed to strengthen the body, sharpen the mind, or awaken particular moods. A king's personal aroma was as much a part of his public image as his seal or his crown. In some courts, it was said you could smell the monarch before you saw him, and if the scent lingered in a room after he left, it was a sign of his blessing. In this court, the practice has been refined into an art form, a small but telling oddity tonight. The king's chamber has been prepared with 3 distinct layers of scent. First, the floor rushes are freshened with crushed mint and rosemary to cool the air. Second, the walls have been rubbed with an oil of myrrh and rose to radiate a warm, steady sweetness. Third, a brazier in the center releases slow spirals of ambergris and cinnamon, their mingled smoke catching in your hair and clothes until you carry the chamber with you when you leave. The king appears barefoot, in a robe the color of pale honey, and walks the room slowly as if inspecting an invisible architecture. He stops at the brazier, lifts a carved ivory spoon, and adds a pinch of saffron to the embers. The smoke deepens, shifting from gold to a darker, almost spiced wine shade. The courtiers watching hold their breath, not out of awe, but because every change in the chamber's scent is meant to be felt, not just noticed. Some scholars argue that this layering of aromas was more than sensory indulgence. It was psychological conditioning. Different scent combinations could subtly alter how courtiers behaved, making them more pliant, more relaxed, or more alert, depending on the king's purpose for the evening. Others suggest the king simply delighted in surrounding himself with fragrances that reminded him of victories abroad and gifts from distant allies. One curious custom in this court: guests to the scented chamber are offered a silk sachet filled with herbs and resins chosen to match the night's blend. The sachet must be carried on their person until the king himself dismisses them from the scent's protection. Tonight's sachet is embroidered with a curling vine motif, and inside you can smell clove, violet, and a trace of musk. The implication is clear: carry this, and you remain within the king's sphere, no matter where you go in the castle. Light joke number 1 wafts into your mind. In a place where politics can hinge on loyalty, the sachet is probably as close as this court gets to a friendship bracelet. The evening's activity is as subtle as the scents themselves. The king and a select few recline on low couches, speaking in low tones while attendants quietly refill goblets with spiced wine. The conversations weave between matters of trade, an upcoming feast, and a whispered remark about the Queen's latest embroidery commission. The scent is the constant thread, binding every exchange into the same languid rhythm. A moment catches your attention. The king leans toward a visiting envoy and offers his sachet, not the envoy's own, but the one he has been wearing. The envoy accepts with both hands, bowing low. This is no casual gesture. Here, to share one's scent is to extend trust, or at least the performance of it. There is no clear consensus among historians about how binding these fragrant exchanges truly were. Some claim they marked informal pacts, as significant as written treaties. Others dismiss them as ceremonial flourishes with no lasting political weight. But the way the envoy tucks the sachet inside his robe makes you think this one will be remembered. Light joke number 2 curls in. Somewhere in the archives, there's probably a stack of treaties that smell like cloves and victory. When the brazier's smoke finally thins, the attendants open the shutters to let in the night air. The shift is startling. Suddenly the scents loosen their hold, and the conversations pick up speed, as if everyone had been moving through a warm, slow current and just found their way to open water. As you step into the corridor, the sachet in your own hand is warm from your grip. The fragrance clings stubbornly, and you realize it will outlast the memory of any particular word spoken tonight. The king knows this. Words can be misremembered, rephrased, even denied, but scent lingers. Light joke number 3 settles as you walk away. If the king ever lost his throne, he could probably run the most intimidating perfume shop in the realm. The royal bedchamber is quiet when you arrive tonight, though not with the tense stillness of a ceremony about to begin. This is the kind of quiet that hums under the skin, as if the room itself is holding a secret. You quickly see why the walls are alive with color. Every inch is painted in rich, winding scenes, and the longer you look, the less certain you are about what's being shown. These are the allegorical bed murals, and they are nothing like the pious saints and hunting scenes that decorate other rooms in the castle. Contemporary chronicles tell us that murals in royal chambers often carried layered meanings. They could display dynastic history, moral lessons, or mythical tales, images meant to remind the ruler of his duties, even in moments of leisure. In this chamber, though, the king's chosen subjects are a whisper more dangerous. Swans glide across a dark lake that gleams like polished onyx. A lion rests in the shade of a pear tree heavy with gold fruit. A knight kneels before a crowned woman whose face is hidden by a silver mask. Every figure is painted just a little larger than life, so they seem to lean toward you if you stare too long. A curious custom in this court is that the meaning of these murals is never explained openly. Only the king, the painter, and perhaps 1 or 2 trusted attendants know the true interpretations. Everyone else is left to guess, which is likely the point. In a place where power thrives on mystery, even wall paint becomes part of the game. You move closer to one panel that catches your eye. It shows a bridge arching over a stream, but the water runs upward into the clouds. On the far side stands a stag with 1 golden antler and 1 bear, as if caught between youth and age. The brushstrokes are so fine you can see the veins in the leaves of the nearby oak. It would be beautiful in any setting, but here, above the royal bed, it takes on a charge that makes the air taste faintly of metal. Some researchers suggest that the murals act as a kind of coded diary. Each element might mark an event, a triumph, or a private bond known only to a few. Others think they are more like visual riddles, meant to spark conversation or test a guest's wit. A few go further, insisting the images were chosen to remind both king and companion that pleasure and politics were threads of the same weave. Near the foot of the bed, the scene shifts to something more intimate. A pair of doves locked beak to beak, wings spread in a circle. The painter has worked a faint spiral into the background, so that your eye can't help but follow it inward. One courtier once claimed the spiral was a map, leading to a real location in the castle. Another swore it was a charm to keep the king's desires from wandering. You suspect both explanations are at least half invention. As the king enters, he doesn't glance at the murals. He doesn't need to. They are as familiar to him as his own reflection. Instead, he steps to a small table and uncovers a set of miniature brushes and jars of pigment. You realize with a start that the murals are not static. They are touched up, adjusted, even subtly changed over time. A leaf that once curled downward now reaches for the sky. The mask on the crowned woman was once gold, now silver. It is a living canvas, and the king is its curator. He dips a brush into a deep green, leans forward, and adds a single vine curling around the base of the stag's oak. It's a tiny change, one no casual visitor would notice, but here it feels like altering the rhythm of a song. Behind you, an attendant clears his throat, almost imperceptibly, as if to remind the king that paint can be as political as parchment. You can't help imagining the whispers tomorrow if someone notices the change. In this court, even a new vine could be read as a signal of favor granted, a bond renewed, or a warning to be heeded. If nothing else, it might drive the gossipers mad, which could be half the fun. By the time you leave, the scent of pigment and beeswax lingers in your hair. The murals seem to follow you with their eyes, as if daring you to decode them. And you have to admit, if your walls looked like this, you might never need to say a word. People would spend years trying to read you without ever getting to the end. The air in the king's antechamber tonight feels charged, as though something small yet precious is about to be revealed. You soon see why on a low table sits an array of ornate talismans, each shimmering in the lamplight. These are the bejeweled protective charms, worn close to the king's skin on nights when he believed passion and fortune needed a little extra persuasion. Surviving inventories from the royal treasury note that such charms were not uncommon among medieval rulers. Amulets, pendants, and rings were often set with stones, thought to inspire love, fertility, or endurance. Some were carved with prayers, others with symbols so old their meaning was already half forgotten in the king's own day. In a world without modern medicine, the right charm could be as reassuring as an army at the gates. One curious feature of this king's collection is its deliberate diversity. Among the gold and enamel pieces from local workshops are items from distant coasts. A jade disc the size of a coin, a filigreed silver cross containing a flake of bone, a palm-sized amber carving shaped like a sleeping fox. Each one comes with a story, and most of the stories are contradictory depending on who tells them. The fox, for example, is said by one courtier to make its owner irresistible, while another swears it helps the wearer slip away unseen after an indiscretion. The king enters wearing a robe patterned with tiny suns. Without hesitation, he lifts a narrow velvet tray and begins selecting charms, as though dressing himself in sentences rather than ornaments. A ruby set in a bronze band goes on his left wrist. A tiny crystal vial of perfumed oil is fastened at his belt, and the jade disc disappears into the folds of his robe. Each piece is handled with care, its position as deliberate as the placement of a knight on a chessboard. Some scholars believe that arranging these charms was a form of ritual focus, helping the king steady his mind before stepping into the complex negotiations of intimacy and alliance. Others suggest the charms were a way to cloak vulnerability in spectacle. If you cannot control the outcome, you can at least control the symbolism. An unusual detail in this court's practice. Before the charms are worn, they are awakened by passing them over a shallow brazier of smouldering herbs. The smoke curls around each piece, supposedly clearing away any ill will they may have gathered. The scent is sharp sage, juniper, and something bitter you can't quite name. It clings faintly to the jewels afterward, as if they've been given their own invisible armor. A visiting envoy once remarked, in a half-whisper, that the king's charm-wearing habits reminded him of a gambler stacking dice before a throw. The comparison might be more accurate than the king would ever admit. The court is a game, and these charms are part of the stakes. Tonight, as the last piece, a narrow chain of gold links is clasped around his neck. The king studies his reflection in a polished bronze mirror. There's no vanity in his expression, only a quiet satisfaction, as if the ritual is now complete. The mirror catches the glow of the lamp, sending a ripple of light over the charms. For a moment, the room looks like a treasure hoard that has decided to stand upright and walk into the night. On your way out, you pass a servant carefully returning the unused charms to a locked chest. The sound of the key turning in the lock is soft but final. You can almost hear the talismans inside settling into silence, waiting for the next night when their turn will come again. The castle kitchens are strangely quiet tonight, save for the faint clink of ladles in the scullery. You follow the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted chestnuts to the upper gallery, where the king is preparing for what he calls his ritual fasting temptations. It sounds like a contradiction, but here, contradiction is a tradition in its own right. According to accounts preserved in the household almoner's notes, some rulers believed that a short period of abstinence, especially from rich foods and wine, would sharpen the senses and heighten the pleasures that followed. In certain courts, this principle extended to intimacy, with the idea that a controlled hunger, whether of the stomach or the heart, would make the eventual indulgence more powerful. It was part discipline, part theatre, and part test of will. The king's variation has a twist. Before the fast begins, he surrounds himself with exactly the things he's denying himself. A long table has been set up beside the gallery windows, groaning under the weight of delicacies, glazed figs glistening like amber beads, steaming platters of spiced venison, silver bowls of whipped cream piled high enough to tempt even the most resolute. Every bite is meant to be refused, at least until the moment the ritual ends. The scent in the air is maddening. You notice that even the attendants shift uneasily, their eyes drawn to the glossy roast apples and sugared almonds. One footman clears his throat and quickly looks away from the cheese plate as if afraid the Stilton might bewitch him. A lesser-known detail of the practice is that the king invites a small audience, never more than 6 people chosen from those he most wishes to impress. The evening is spent in conversation, sipping only water infused with herbs, while the untouched feast looms in the corner like a challenge issued to the senses. It's said that watching him resist the food and drink without faltering is a performance in itself, a silent promise that he can command his own appetites. Not everyone in the court sees it as noble discipline. One lady-in-waiting once whispered that the king simply liked to make the rest of them suffer alongside him. She claimed the ritual was less about self-control and more about the gleam in his eye when someone accidentally sighed at the smell of cinnamon. As the evening deepens, the king moves through the room with an ease that suggests this denial costs him little. Yet you notice a subtle rhythm. He circles the table every so often, pausing at certain dishes just long enough to inhale their fragrance. It's as if he's reminding himself and everyone watching that temptation only has power when you stand close enough to feel it. Some scholars read these rituals as a form of political theatre, demonstrating the ruler's mastery over both body and desire. Others think it was simply a clever way to heighten anticipation for the private moments that followed, when the feast and perhaps other indulgences could finally be enjoyed. When the fast is officially broken at the stroke of midnight, the king lifts a single fig from the table, takes one slow bite, and sets the rest down. The tension in the room releases like a held breath. Guests are invited to eat, and the feast erupts into motion, goblets filled, knives carving, laughter spilling like wine. The king eats very little, but the satisfaction on his face is unmistakable. He's not measuring fullness in food tonight, but in the knowledge that everyone here saw him stand unshaken in the face of excess. As you leave, you catch the faintest echo of his voice behind you, speaking to a favored guest. The sweetest hunger is the one you choose. In this court, even appetite is an art form. The torchlight in the west corridor wavers tonight, catching on the polished helmets of 2 guards who stand as still as carved statues. Beyond them lies the rehearsal hall, but tonight there are no musicians or dancers, only a long strip of carpet leading to a raised platform. This is where the king hosts the mimic courtier, a private spectacle in which a trusted double enacts the king's own prowess before an invited audience. In letters smuggled out by an amused ambassador, we learn that imitations of monarchs were not always insults. In some courts, they were sanctioned performances meant to impress visiting dignitaries. The double would act out scenes of bravery, eloquence, or even charm in private company, giving the king a way to intimidate rivals without revealing too much of himself. Here, that tradition has been sharpened into something more peculiar. This double is not just mimicking speeches or swordplay. He's replicating the king's private mannerisms, the subtle glances, the pauses, the slow curl of a smile that the court whispers about but rarely witnesses. The man himself is waiting when you enter. He's dressed in garments nearly identical to the king's, down to the pattern on the velvet cuffs. The likeness is uncanny. Only the slightly sharper line of his jaw gives him away. He steps onto the platform and begins a slow circuit, greeting imaginary guests, pausing to accept invisible goblets, turning his head at the precise angle that flatters the royal profile. It's equal parts, theatre and study, every gesture rehearsed until it feels natural. An odd touch in this court's version of the tradition is that the king often watches from the shadows, unseen by the guests. He uses the performance as a mirror, gauging which mannerisms elicit admiration, laughter, or even unease. It's said that after one such evening, he quietly dropped a favoured phrase from his public speeches when he saw the audience wince at it on the double's lips. Tonight's audience includes a handful of envoys from a neighbouring realm, and their eyes are fixed on the mimic. At one point, the double leans in toward an envoy, says something too soft for you to hear, and then throws his head back in a warm laugh. The envoy laughs too, but it's the nervous kind of laugh that comes when you're not sure whether you've been flattered or warned. Some observers claim these mimic performances were the king's way of testing how far he could push an image before it broke. Others suggest it was simply a game, allowing him to enjoy the thrill of his own persona from the outside. Either way, the mimic seems to relish his role, moving with the ease of a man who knows the rules of the charade by heart. Near the end, the double performs a mock audience with a pretend petitioner. His voice shifts lower, more measured, and for a moment you forget it's not the king himself speaking. When the final bow comes, the audience rises, not with thunderous applause, but with the quiet satisfaction of those who have seen something intimate without the risk of truly being inside it. As the guests file out, the king steps from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He claps the mimic once on the shoulder, a gesture that could be gratitude or a reminder of who the role truly belongs to. Then they part, each disappearing into opposite corridors like actors leaving a stage. You leave with the odd sensation that you've just watched the king court, the court itself without ever touching the stage. In this castle, even imitation has teeth. The grand hall has been stripped of its usual hierarchy tonight. No thrones, no seating plans that signal rank, only a broad expanse of polished floor gleaming under hundreds of candles. Guests slip in behind half masks of velvet and lace. The air is charged with the promise of the royal masquerade, an event where names dissolve, titles are muted, and even the king becomes just another masked figure in the crowd. From the surviving descriptions in court diaries, we know that masquerades in medieval courts were more than entertainments. They were tools. Behind a mask, a noble could speak more freely, flirt without fear of scandal, or test alliances without leaving fingerprints. The king, hidden among them, could eavesdrop on honest opinions or plant rumors with his own lips, knowing they'd be carried away by people who would never guess their source. In this court, the masquerade begins with an inversion of the usual order. The herald announces that for the next 3 hours, all participants will be addressed only by the name of the creature or symbol depicted on their mask. Tonight, there's a fox with jeweled eyes, a raven with feathers tipped in silver, a stag whose antlers are carved from polished bone, and a serpentine mask coiled around the wearer's head, so convincingly it makes you blink twice. Somewhere among them, the king is moving, but you can't tell which face is his. A small but telling twist in this tradition. The king commissions his own mask fresh for every masquerade, and each design contains one hidden flaw, a slightly misaligned jewel, a scratch in the paint, a tiny crack in the lacquer. Those who can spot it and name it aloud are granted a private word with him before the night ends. It's both a game and a subtle intelligence test, one that rewards keen observation over courtly polish. The dancing starts slowly, partners changing every few steps, as the musicians weave a rhythm that feels like a conversation between drum and harp. Snatches of whispered exchanges drift past you, a veiled warning about a border dispute, an inquiry about a noble's absent daughter, a promise to deliver a package before the next moonrise. No one seems to care that these words hang in the air like smoke. They'll vanish as soon as masks are removed. At one point, you notice a masked figure in deep green slipping quietly from the crowd toward the balcony. Two others follow, their masks glinting in the candlelight. The music swells, drowning out whatever words pass between them, but the way the green masked figure turns his head once sharply makes you think this is no mere flirtation. Some scholars interpret these gatherings as political safety valves, allowing tensions to bleed away in a haze of anonymity. Others see them as the king's most dangerous stage, where one misstep in conversation could hand him a weapon or give him cause to wield one. The night ends not with a grand unmasking, but with the slow, deliberate extinguishing of candles. One by one, pools of light vanish into darkness, and the crowd becomes a whispering tide moving toward the exits. Somewhere in the dimness, you catch a glimpse of a mask lying abandoned on a table, plain black velvet, with a single imperfect pearl at the temple. You don't need confirmation to know whose it was. As you step out into the cooler air of the corridor, the scents of wax and wine still clinging to you, it occurs to you that the true power of the masquerade isn't in hiding identities, it's in letting them flicker just long enough for the king to decide what they're worth. The long gallery outside the royal apartments hums with a nervous energy tonight. Courtiers shift their weight from foot to foot, fanning themselves with folded programs that list nothing but the words "First Night Observance." You've heard of it before, what the court calls the public bedding ceremony, but nothing quite prepares you for the blend of theatre and intrusion it represents. According to descriptions in noble family records, this custom served a practical purpose. It offered witnesses to the consummation of a marriage, ensuring legitimacy of any heirs. In some courts, the moment itself was only symbolically observed, with the couple retiring behind curtains while the company lingered just long enough to see them in bed together. In others less discreet, there was little room left for interpretation. Here, the king's version balances on that fine line between proof and performance. The ceremony begins with a slow procession from the great hall. The king and his new queen walk side by side, flanked by torchbearers whose flames turn the silk of their robes into flowing rivers of color. The crowd follows at a respectful distance, speaking in hushed tones as if entering a chapel. At the door to the bedchamber, a steward announces them by full titles, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Inside, the room is already warm from the banked fire in the hearth. The bed itself has been transformed into a stage, heavy damask curtains drawn back, pillows arranged in a precise pattern of red and gold, and a coverlet embroidered with scenes of mythical lovers. The air smells of rosewater and something sharper, perhaps ginger, meant to invigorate. One detail unique to this court's tradition: before the couple steps onto the dais, a herald reads aloud a short poem commissioned for the occasion. It always ends with the same line, "May the crown rest lighter for the weight it gains tonight." No one says who wrote the first version, but the phrase has been used for 3 generations. The king helps the queen remove her outer robe, folding it himself, instead of letting a servant take it, an act that draws murmurs of approval from the crowd. She returns the gesture, unclasping the heavy chain around his shoulders and setting it gently aside. They sit on the edge of the bed, holding hands, while a senior courtier offers a goblet of spiced wine for them to share. The sip is slow, ceremonial, the passing of the cup between them deliberate. Some scholars interpret these moments as a form of political reassurance, showing the realm that harmony exists between the sovereign and consort from the very first night. Others point out the underlying tension. This is as much about displaying control under scrutiny as it is about affection. Once the wine is set down, the steward makes a final announcement. The couple will now retire to their rest. At this signal, the curtains are drawn halfway, not closed, but enough to veil them in shadow. The witnesses stand in silence for the span of 30 heartbeats, then bow and withdraw. It is a strange kind of applause, soundless, yet charged with the knowledge that what they've seen will be discussed for weeks. As you leave with the rest, you catch a glimpse through the narrowing gap in the curtains, the king leaning toward the queen, speaking words only she will ever know. The way her shoulders relax tells you the performance has ended, and something more private has begun. In the corridor, the air feels cooler, but the smell of rosewater clings stubbornly. It will trail behind you the rest of the night. A reminder that in this court, even the most intimate moments are braided tightly with the public's gaze. And perhaps that is the point the witnesses leave, believing they've seen enough, while the real beginning takes place in the space no one can truly enter. The moon is barely a sliver tonight, but the castle is brighter than ever, thanks to 1,000 flickering lanterns suspended from the trellises outside the royal hunting lodge. The courtyard is a living portrait of excess, with nobles arriving in their finest robes, the scent of fresh flowers mixing with the earthy tang of the nearby stables. This is the night of scented hunting lodges, a practice that, like many in this court, blurs the line between the ritual and the indulgent. In some places, the hunt is a test of skill, a matter of survival, a chance for nobles to prove themselves. Here, it is not just about tracking the stag, but about tracking the senses themselves. The idea, as explained by a visiting huntsman years ago, is that the hunt becomes less about the animal and more about the space between hunter and prey, a moment of connection, or more likely, dominance. The quarry might be a stag or a wild boar, but the real goal, it seems, is the sensory experience of it all. The king leads the way, walking slowly through the flower-draped path, his expression calm, almost meditative. His attire is different from the usual royal robes. Tonight, he wears leather and fur, layered carefully, but with obvious luxury. His boots are polished to a mirror shine, and in his hand, he carries a finely crafted bow, an instrument both for sport and for status. The hunters who follow him mirror his every movement with practiced precision, never straying too far from the king's shadow. One curious feature of this court's hunting tradition: the entire lodge is scented for the evening before the hunt begins. As the nobles enter, they're hit with waves of intoxicating fragrances: lavender, thyme, pine, and something else you can't quite name. The purpose? To heighten the senses, to prepare the body for the chase. A gentle but unmistakable tension fills the air as the guests adjust to the thick, heady aroma. The king's advisors speak often of the ritual air, an invisible and intangible element that seems to pervade these hunts. There's a belief, half serious, that if the air is not properly prepared, the hunt will be less successful or worse, that the animal will slip away unnoticed. Some say it's superstition. Others argue it's an old tradition dating back to the earliest kings of the realm. Either way, the scent is thick, almost overwhelming, and the nobles wear it like armor, their movements subtly swaying as they adjust to the heady atmosphere. Historians still argue whether the lodge's overpowering scent was intended to unbalance the guests or to sharpen them for the task at hand. Some believe it was all part of the king's fascination with control, how one could manage a room, a hunt, even a heart, by manipulating the smallest of senses. Others say it was about creating an atmosphere where nothing was quite as it seemed, where even the most straightforward of tasks, like a hunt, became a test of perception. After a short procession, the king halts in front of a great oak tree, its branches nearly bare against the night sky. He turns to face his company, raising his bow as if to give them an opportunity to marvel at the craftsmanship. The assembly stares at the bow with a mix of admiration and anxiety. Only those of highest rank are ever permitted to use such a weapon. The king nocks an arrow, takes aim at a target set high among the branches, and releases. The sound of the arrow cutting the air rings through the cold night like a secret. The arrow strikes true, and a murmur of approval ripples through the crowd. It's a controlled display of skill, yet there's an almost theatrical quality to it, as if the bow and its purpose were never meant to be practical, but simply a way to reaffirm the king's mastery over both space and people. The hunt itself is more ceremonial than physical. The stag, though majestic, is merely a symbol caught not by speed or strength, but by the force of the king's intention. No blood is spilled in these hunts, no danger is faced. Instead, the game is played out in the subtle gestures of the participants, the shifting of their feet, the glances exchanged under the shifting lantern light. The true challenge lies in maintaining the perfect balance between dominance and decorum. As the evening winds down and the guests return to the lodge, the scent in the air seems to settle, like an invisible weight that's slowly lifted from the room. The king dismisses his guests with a calm nod, his face serene. He is as much the hunter as he is the game. In this court, even the most primitive act becomes a dance of manipulation and poise. As you leave, you catch the faintest scent of pine lingering in your cloak, and you wonder how much of it was real, and how much of it was just part of the king's endless control over his environment. The castle's chapel is quiet tonight, its high arches bathed in soft candlelight that flickers like the promise of something ancient. You've heard of sacred relic encounters before, but no story truly prepares you for the weight of the silence that surrounds these moments. The air feels thick with expectation, not for the ceremony itself, but for the way it will twist into something more personal, more intimate than anyone expects. Surviving accounts of royal relic encounters often emphasize their power as both spiritual acts and political gestures. The relics, whether pieces of the true cross, bones of saints, or fragments of sacred scrolls, were seen not just as objects of faith but as instruments of divine right. In this court, the king's interactions with such relics were never just about devotion. They were about reinforcing his rule, ensuring that heaven itself was seen as a silent supporter of his reign. Tonight, a small procession enters the chapel, and you realize that it's not just the king who is present. Several high-ranking clergy walk beside him, their robes trailing like whispers, and each one carries a relic, a vial of holy oil, a small wooden box containing bone fragments, a golden cross set with tiny diamonds. The relics are not only sacred but spectacular, their very presence in the king's court elevating him from monarch to a man blessed by the divine. An unusual element of this court's practice is that the relics are tested by the king himself. Before they are presented to the gathered nobles or used in any official ceremony, they are taken to the royal chapel for a private moment of connection. Here the king examines each relic, often in complete silence, allowing the weight of the object to press against him, as if seeking reassurance from something beyond the earthly realm. The quiet hum of candlelight is the only sound as he holds each piece, his fingers brushing the smooth, cool surfaces of the reliquaries. Some experts claim these encounters were meant to demonstrate the king's closeness to the divine, his access to holy favor. Others suggest that it was simply a form of ritual affirmation, a personal, intimate act of self-empowerment disguised as devotion. Either way, the effect on the court is the same. Those who are granted access to the chapel during these encounters leave with a heightened sense of the king's legitimacy, as though the very air inside this room is touched by heaven. One lesser-known fact about these rituals is that the king is never alone in the chapel. He is always accompanied by a small group of trusted nobles or advisors, each standing quietly at the edges of the room, observing. The presence of others is meant to keep the moment sacred and solemn, but in truth, it serves another purpose. It reinforces the hierarchy of power. The king may be holding the relic, but it is the court and the witnesses who are watching. They see not just the sacred act, but the act of dominance that accompanies it. Tonight, the king raises a vial of holy oil toward the light. The liquid inside catches the glow of the candles, reflecting it in fractured patterns across the stone walls. The movement is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. There is something in the way he handles the vial, as if he is measuring the distance between divinity and himself. The clergy surrounding him bow their heads, and the room, once buzzing with hushed whispers, grows still. Even the flames seem to quiet, their flickers softened as though recognizing the significance of the moment. Historians still debate whether these relic encounters were moments of genuine spiritual engagement or simply carefully orchestrated performances meant to reinforce royal authority. Some claim the king's actions were deeply pious, while others see them as more akin to theatrical gestures meant to sway both his court and his subjects. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between the two. As the ceremony concludes, the relics are returned to their resting places, the king's hands lingering on each one just a moment longer than necessary. He stands for a moment in the silence of the chapel, eyes closed, as if measuring the weight of what has just passed. And then, with a soft motion, he turns and walks out, leaving the chapel to the quiet that will stretch until the next encounter. As you follow the procession back into the castle corridors, the air feels heavier somehow, as if the sacred has brushed against the mundane. The scent of candle wax and incense lingers in your lungs, a reminder that even in the stillness of prayer, the court's power moves silently in the background. The royal library is unusually empty tonight, save for the flickering candle flames that line the walls and the quiet shuffle of footsteps on the stone floor. You have entered the heart of the jester's provocations, an arena where sharp wit becomes a blade, and every laugh carries the weight of an unspoken challenge. Historians often gloss over the role of jesters in medieval courts, but here, in this kingdom, their function is far more complex than simple entertainment. These men and women are both confidantes and provocateurs, entrusted with the delicate task of speaking truth under the guise of humor. They possess the rare ability to challenge the king and his courtiers without fear of reprisal, all while remaining untouchable because of their role as fools. It is a delicate, almost dangerous balance. The king enters quietly, not as the ruler, but as a participant in the game. His expression is unreadable, a mask carefully crafted for the occasion. He is not here tonight to command, but to listen, to engage in a game of words where the usual rules don't apply. The jesters are gathered in a small circle, each dressed in the bright, mismatched garb that sets them apart from the rest of the court. They are speaking in rapid fire, tossing playful barbs at each other, weaving jokes into riddles, and setting the stage for the king to join them. It's said that the king himself enjoys these sessions because they allow him to hear the truth unadorned, raw, and often buried beneath layers of laughter, an unusual detail of this court's tradition. Before any jesting begins, each jester must present a provocation, a statement or question designed to test the boundaries of the royal court's behavior. It might be a pointed question about the Queen's latest venture into the arts, or a satirical take on the state of the kingdom's finances. The king's response, while often quiet and measured, carries more weight than any decree. A mere chuckle from him can send ripples through the court, altering the tone of an entire evening's entertainment. Tonight's provocation is daring a question aimed squarely at the king. Sire, tell us this. If you were not king, what would you be doing instead? Would you be a farmer, a soldier, or perhaps something less noble? The jesters laugh, but it's a laugh tinged with something sharper. They're asking a question of power, testing the king's understanding of himself. It's a subtle challenge wrapped in humor, a question no one else could dare ask. The king's response is slow, deliberate. I would be a shepherd, leading a flock that never strays from the path, he says, his voice carrying across the room. The jesters exchange quick glances, their laughter fading into a tense silence. For a moment, it seems the king's words have shifted the mood in the room. What was once playful now feels like a riddle, like a deeper truth is waiting just beneath the surface. Some experts believe that these provocations are a way for the king to gauge the mood of his court without the usual formalities. Others suggest that the jesters serve as mirrors, reflecting the hidden thoughts of those around them, speaking what others cannot. Either way, the jesters' questions are often the only moments when the king is not in control, allowing the royal facade to slip, even if just for a heartbeat. As the evening wears on, the jesters begin their traditional performance, weaving absurd stories and twisted parables. They mimic the nobles, the court's customs, and even the king himself. Their humor is sharp, but beneath it, there's always a kernel of truth. They are performers, but also truth-tellers in the most dangerous sense. A single word, a single joke, can change the entire course of court politics, a small but telling custom. No matter how far the jesters push their humor, they never cross the line into insult. Instead, they work within the confines of laughter, planting seeds of thought that will take root in the minds of their audience. The king knows this well. He's the first to laugh, but he's also the first to listen. As the night ends, you realize something unsettling. The jesters have left you with a question too. What is it about laughter that makes it such a powerful weapon? And why does it seem that the king is the only one who truly understands how to wield it? The night air is sharp as you follow the winding path that leads to the castle's moonlit gardens. The courtyard is hushed, but there's a quiet intensity in the air, an energy that you can't quite place. Tonight, the king has invited a small group of his most trusted advisors to the moonlit bathing rites, an ancient custom that blends politics, strategy, and a touch of the sacred. The ritual, as described in old records, is meant to be both purification and renewal. The moon, as the king once said, is a mirror to the heavens, and bathing beneath its light is a way of aligning oneself with both divine and earthly power. But it is also deeply personal, a moment of connection between the king and his closest allies, who are required to partake in the ritual alongside him. The ceremony begins with the lighting of hundreds of small lanterns around the garden. The scent of jasmine and night-blooming flowers drifts on the breeze, mixing with the smell of the stone that has absorbed the warmth of the day. At the far end of the garden, a large marble pool reflects the sky above, still and calm, as if awaiting its guests. The king steps forward, his robe a soft shade of lavender that seems to shimmer in the moonlight. His expression is unreadable, the lines of his face softened by the gentle light. He holds out his hand to the first advisor, a gesture both welcoming and commanding. The advisors bow, and one by one, they step forward, shedding their outer robes and entering the water. The king follows, his steps careful, deliberate, as if he is testing the waters not just of the pool, but of the moment itself. The water is cool, the perfect temperature for a night like this. As the king settles into the pool, the atmosphere shifts, a quiet, almost palpable sense of ritual taking over. The advisors stand silently, their bodies half submerged, as the king begins to speak. His voice is low, reverberating softly over the still water. He talks of strategy, alliances, and the changing tides of the realm. His words are weighty, but there's an undercurrent of something else, something deeper. The advisors listen intently, each one aware that these conversations are not meant to be overheard, not meant to be shared. The ritual bath is as much a test of loyalty as it is a spiritual practice. In this moment, the king is both sovereign and sage, his words carefully chosen to probe, to test, and to challenge those who are closest to him. One advisor, ever eager to impress, speaks first, offering a suggestion regarding an impending diplomatic mission. The king nods, but there's no immediate response. Instead, he shifts slightly in the water, gazing up at the moon as though it holds the answer. The silence stretches, and you realize this is the true essence of the rite, the power of quiet observation. In the absence of immediate reaction, the advisors are forced to fill the space with their own thoughts, their own interpretations. Historians still argue whether these moonlit baths were about strengthening the kingdom's bonds, or simply about testing the loyalty of the king's inner circle. Some say the king used the stillness of the ritual to probe deeper into the minds of his advisors, forcing them to articulate their thoughts without the distractions of the court's usual pomp and ceremony. Others believe the bathing rites were a means of purifying the court's atmosphere, clearing away any lingering doubts or resentment before making important decisions. A small but telling ritual. The king always ends the ceremony with a quiet, deliberate act, plucking a single flower from the garden and tossing it into the pool. The flower floats gently on the surface, its petals unfurling in the water's cool embrace. It is a gesture of offering, of renewal, but it is also a reminder that even the most powerful ruler is at the mercy of nature, of forces beyond his control. As the ritual ends and the advisors slowly leave the water, you notice the quiet shift that occurs in the king's demeanor. He rises from the pool, his posture straighter, his movements more deliberate. He has received what he needed from the ritual, both the physical renewal and the affirmation of his power. The advisors, dripping and wrapped in fresh robes, disperse quietly into the shadows, their minds heavy with the weight of the king's words. You stand in the garden for a moment longer, watching the moon's reflection ripple gently on the water. There is no mistaking the sense that something significant has just occurred, not just a ritual, but a deeper transaction, a quiet reaffirmation of the power that flows through the castle's veins. The evening is soft with twilight as you approach the great hall, where the low hum of conversation drifts through the stone corridors. Tonight is unlike any other, for it is public bedding night, a spectacle that walks a fine line between political necessity and spectacle. It is not just the ritual of consummation that brings everyone together, it's the performance of it, the idea that the act itself carries weight beyond the personal, that it's a public promise made in front of witnesses. According to court records, public bedding was considered an essential step for royal marriages, an affirmation that the union was legitimate and that the king's authority remained unchallenged. Yet in this court, where every action is a potential statement, the bedding ceremony has become an intricate performance of its own. The royal couple enters with a procession as if stepping into a theatre. The queen, resplendent in a gown of embroidered silver, and the king, dressed in regal velvet and gold, his crown balanced lightly on his brow. The guests stand in silence, watching as the pair makes their way to the raised platform at the heart of the hall. What is peculiar about this court's version of the ceremony is the complete lack of privacy. The royal bed is placed beneath a great canopy, but it is not the kind of privacy one might expect. This is no hidden, intimate moment. The bed is draped in gold fabric, its edges embroidered with the kingdom's heraldic symbols, and it stands proudly in the center of the room, as much a symbol of the monarchy as a place for rest. The guests, a carefully curated selection of nobles and foreign dignitaries, take their places in rows of velvet chairs that circle the bed. The air is thick with tension and expectation, and you feel the weight of every gaze. The king and queen stand for a moment, exchanging a look that is neither too shy nor too bold, but somehow carefully measured. This is not a marriage of two hearts. It is the marriage of two pieces of a greater puzzle, each one fulfilling its role in the greater scheme of royal politics. An unusual aspect of this ceremony is the declaration made before the bedding takes place. The king raises his voice and declares, "By the union of our bodies, the kingdom is strengthened, and our bloodlines are secured." It is a statement meant to affirm not only the legitimacy of the marriage, but the stability of the crown itself. There is power in the words, and you can feel it ripple through the room. One might think this is where the ceremony ends, but not in this court. The king turns to face the gathered assembly, his voice lowering. "You have witnessed our union. You will bear witness to the strength of the crown," he says, as though the very act of their marriage is a contract not just between them, but between the royal family and the kingdom itself. The line between public and private is already blurred, and in this court, it is always about the spectacle, always about what is seen and what is known. Historians have long debated the true purpose of the public bedding ceremony. Some say it was a solemn act of royal duty, ensuring that the union was both legitimate and unassailable. Others argue it was a deliberate act of power, demonstrating not just the king's control over the queen, but his control over the realm. The idea that the royal couple must be witnessed, that their bond must be shared with the court, speaks volumes about the kingdom's culture, where nothing is purely personal, where even the most intimate moments are tied to duty and to the public gaze. As the king and queen finally retreat beneath the canopy, you notice the careful choreography that follows. The guests slowly begin to file out, their murmurs a mix of politeness and curiosity, each one knowing they have just witnessed a significant event, an event that will be spoken of for weeks, or perhaps years. The ceremony may be over, but the ripples will be felt long after the final guest has left. In the corridors beyond the hall, you feel the weight of the evening's performance still in the air, as though the very stones of the castle are holding their breath. This, too, is part of the crown's power, the ability to make even the most personal acts of union into a statement of governance. The quiet of the royal stables is broken only by the soft shuffle of hooves on straw and the faint echo of distant laughter. Tonight, the king has invited a select few to witness what is known here as the perfumed hunting lodges, a strange combination of leisure and politicking where the pleasures of the hunt are layered with the fragrance of luxury. The nobles have arrived, each carrying the scent of their personal choices: lavender, rose, myrrh, adding to the already heady atmosphere of the lodge. This, like many things in the king's court, is both spectacle and strategy. The hunt is not meant to be a test of skill or speed. It is about the symbolic act of the chase itself, the idea of dominating nature with both control and indulgence. But there's more to it than that. The air in the lodge is thick with floral scents, incense smoke, and the perfume of the finest silks. Every corner of the space is designed to entice and overwhelm the senses, to create an atmosphere that shifts from the earthy smell of leather and horses to the sweet perfume of power. As the guests arrive, they are greeted not just with the usual fare of wines and fruits, but with the presence of the king himself, who stands at the center of the gathering in a robe that seems to shimmer in the flickering candlelight. His presence is the centerpiece, but tonight, his attention is not just on the festivities, it's on the manipulation of the atmosphere. He gestures for the courtiers to step forward and inhale the scents, asking them which they prefer and how they feel. It's an odd question to ask in a hunting lodge, where the thrill of the chase might seem more important than the sensory indulgences surrounding it. But this is the king's way of testing control. The perfumes are more than luxury. They are a tool, a way to sway those around him. One curious detail: the king insists that each noble select a fragrance, but only after they've walked the stables themselves, where the scent of horse and leather is at its strongest. It's a peculiar inversion of expectation, forcing the court to step into the rough, the untamed, before they can truly appreciate the curated luxury of the lodge. The king believes that true power lies in understanding both sides of the coin, the wild and the refined. As the evening progresses, a light-hearted game begins, where courtiers are paired to discuss their chosen scents. The rules are simple. They must persuade one another of the power of their selection, the one who makes the most convincing argument winning the favor of the king. The stakes are small, but the message is clear. Even something as simple as fragrance can be used to influence those around you. The king watches, his gaze sharp, amused by the display. He has crafted a room full of perfumed puppets, each one maneuvering to maintain favor, each one playing into his hand without realizing it. Some historians speculate that this hunt wasn't about control over nature, but about the king's control over perception. By forcing the court to engage with scent in such a deliberate way, he weaves power into the very fabric of the evening. He is not just hosting a gathering, he is teaching them the art of subtle persuasion, showing them that influence can be hidden in the smallest of gestures. Others argue that the use of scent is meant to create a sense of unity within the court, binding them together through shared experience. But in this kingdom, unity always comes at a cost. Each decision is a currency, and the king holds the purse. As the evening winds down, the courtiers are given the chance to choose a final scent, one that they will carry with them as they leave the lodge. It's a strange, almost ritualistic act. They are not merely selecting a perfume, they are choosing how they will be remembered, how they will be seen in the king's eyes. The air is thick with choices, each noble trying to read the room, trying to guess what scent will earn them the king's favor. And all the while, the king watches, his eyes alight with the knowledge that they are playing a game where he alone knows the rules. When the last guests depart, the lodge feels quieter, emptier, the scent of lavender and cinnamon hanging faintly in the air. The king's manipulation has been subtle but effective. He has not needed to speak loudly or make grand gestures. He has simply created an environment in which the courtiers moved as he desired, responding to the air itself, to the subtle cues he had planted. Even in something as simple as a perfume, the king has demonstrated his mastery over the game. As you step out into the night air, the scent still lingers, and you realize that in this court, nothing is ever quite as it seems. The king has taught the court another lesson tonight. True power doesn't just lie in what you control, it lies in the senses, the perceptions, and the spaces between. The walls of the royal library are lined with manuscripts, scrolls, and tomes that stretch far beyond the knowledge of most kingdoms. Tonight, however, it is not the weight of history that fills the air, but the quiet murmur of conversation among a select group gathered around the king. This is not a formal meeting, but a confession of the future, a private gathering where the king seeks counsel not from his advisors, but from the small circle of scholars, mystics, and dreamers who make up his inner council. These meetings, though rarely spoken of in court circles, have long been whispered about by those who have been invited. The king does not simply seek advice, he seeks foresight. For some, this is nothing more than superstition. For others, it is the highest form of governance. The mystics who attend this council claim to be able to read the threads of fate, to peer into the future by interpreting omens, dreams, and the subtle movements of the stars. In this room, the king's decisions are not guided solely by politics or strategy. They are shaped by forces far beyond the mortal realm. An unusual custom in these meetings is that the king always begins with a ritualistic silence. No one speaks until the first parchment is unrolled, revealing a single question written in the king's hand. "What must I see in the year to come?" it reads. It is a question that has no clear answer, yet it has been asked in this very library for as long as anyone can remember. The mystics take turns reading the question aloud, each offering their interpretation, their understanding of the kingdom's fate. The king watches quietly, his face unreadable, as the first mystic steps forward. Her eyes are wide, her hands steady, as she draws a line across the air with her fingers. She speaks in riddles, of winds changing direction and clouds splitting into patterns that may or may not signify war, prosperity, or disaster. The court listens in silence, but no one can be sure if they are hearing prophecies or the gentle hum of ritual. The mystics, after all, have never been wrong, at least, not in the way one might think. Their interpretations are rarely straightforward, but their words always linger, twisting in the minds of those who hear them. Historians still debate whether these mystics were truly able to divine the future, or if their words were simply a form of clever manipulation. Some scholars believe the king used their counsel as a form of political theatre, shaping the future by shaping the narrative of what was to come. Others argue that the mystics were genuine, tapping into ancient traditions that had been forgotten by most of the world. Either way, the result was the same. The king always left these meetings with a sense of something beyond knowledge. Tonight, the second mystic steps forward. She holds no parchment, no prepared speech. Instead, she lifts a small glass orb, its surface shimmering with colors that shift like oil on water. The orb, she claims, holds the key to understanding the tides of time. She closes her eyes, her lips moving in a soft, whispered chant, and the room grows still, the air thickening with anticipation. When she opens her eyes again, they are no longer her own. They are the eyes of something ancient, something that knows the threads of fate. "The future is not a straight path," she says quietly, her voice a low hum that seems to reverberate in the room. "It is a web, where every decision creates 1,000 possibilities. What you do now will echo, but it will never be as you expect." The king nods, a small movement, but you can see the shift in him. He understands. This is not about knowing what will happen. It is about knowing that the future is shaped in ways both seen and unseen. The mystics, in their own way, are teaching him that control is an illusion. In this room, there are no definitive answers, only the knowledge that every choice creates ripples. As the meeting draws to a close, the mystics leave in silence, their words hanging in the air like smoke. The king stands alone for a moment, gazing at the dim light of the candles that flicker like uncertain futures. He does not need to ask what will happen next. He already knows. The future is always in motion, and the real power lies not in predicting it, but in responding to it. When you leave the library, the night is quiet again, but the sense of something larger than any single person lingers in the air. The king's decisions may be shaped by politics, but they are also shaped by something more, something that cannot be fully understood, only accepted. In this court, the future is never fully in the king's hands, but he wields it with a quiet, unwavering certainty that makes it seem as though he has mastered fate itself. The night air is cool as you walk toward the castle's inner courtyard, the stars above shimmering like tiny jewels scattered across the sky. There's a feeling of anticipation hanging in the air tonight. The royal circle of trust has gathered once again, but this time there is no official business on the agenda. Instead, the king has summoned a select group of his closest allies to participate in a private ritual that has only whispered rumors circulating around it. The concept of the circle of trust is simple, though few in the court truly understand it. These meetings are not about power, strategy, or alliances, they are about loyalty. The king has long believed that the bond between ruler and subject is only truly tested when it is placed under duress. In these intimate sessions, the king and his trusted few engage in a game of revealing truths personal, political, and sometimes even painful that would otherwise remain unspoken. When you enter the courtyard, you are immediately struck by the stark contrast of the scene before you. The walls are draped in dark velvet tapestries, and a single brazier burns softly, casting shadows that seem to dance around the figures standing near it. The circle of advisers is already gathered, and they stand in quiet, expectant silence as the king approaches. The ceremony is about to begin. The first custom of the circle is that no one speaks until the king does. He steps forward, his hands empty, his face calm but determined. He raises his gaze to the group, his voice carrying the weight of a man who has never needed to beg for loyalty but has learned to demand it when necessary. We have gathered tonight to face not the politics of the kingdom, but the truth of our own hearts, he says, his tone clear and steady. Only by laying bare our most guarded truths can we strengthen the trust between us. This is not a casual statement. It is the beginning of an exchange that will weave together the fates of all present. No one knows exactly what to expect, only that once the process begins, there is no turning back. An unusual aspect of the ritual is the symbolic nature of the tokens passed around the circle. At the king's signal, a wooden bowl is placed at the center of the gathering, filled with small, delicate stones, each one inscribed with an individual's name. The first participant steps forward, their hands trembling just slightly as they reach for one of the stones. This moment is not about ceremony. It is about choosing which part of their personal history they will reveal. Each stone holds the potential to bring forth a truth long hidden, a weakness never before acknowledged. The first to speak is a seasoned advisor, known for his calculated manner and stoic nature. He holds his stone for a moment, his fingers tracing its edge as if considering the weight of the decision. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he speaks. I once advised a king to betray a neighbor, believing it would bring us power. I was wrong, and it cost us dearly. The room is still. The air, already thick with tension, seems to draw in around his words. It is the kind of confession that strips away the veneer of control, exposing the vulnerability of even the most powerful of men. The others in the circle exchange glances, but none speaks. The king nods, his eyes never leaving the advisor. There is no condemnation in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. The ritual demands not judgment, but understanding. Each confession is an opportunity to rebuild the bond of trust, to show that even those who rule can be flawed. As the circle continues, each participant steps forward, taking a stone and revealing their own secrets, weaknesses, or regrets. The confessions range from minor missteps to deeper betrayals, but in each one there is a shared theme, the realization that their actions, no matter how powerful, have always been subject to the unpredictable forces of fate. The king listens quietly to each revelation, offering only brief moments of silence in response. His role is not to guide or correct, but to listen, to receive. The evening is not about finding answers or solving problems. It is about the simple but difficult act of being honest with oneself and one's peers. In this circle, the king is not the ruler. He is simply another member of the group, sharing the same vulnerabilities, the same human flaws. The power that is shared in this space is not political, but personal, built on the understanding that each person in the circle is irrevocably tied to the others. As the ritual concludes, the king stands, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "We are not perfect," he says, his voice carrying the weight of the evening's confessions. "But we are bound by truth, and that is stronger than any title or crown." The guests slowly begin to disperse, the circle broken, but the trust forged in the fire of their shared vulnerability remains. You stand quietly at the edge, watching the participants leave, each carrying their own revelations, but perhaps a deeper connection than before. The ritual has ended, but its effects will linger far beyond the night. In this court, where every glance, every word, every decision carries weight, moments like this are rare. Tonight, the king has shown that power is not always in what is seen, but in what is shared, even in silence. The royal courtyard is still and quiet tonight, the air cool with the promise of dawn just beyond the horizon. The king walks alone, his footsteps light but deliberate, a figure of solitary contemplation against the backdrop of the castle walls. This is the time of night when the king retreats from the court, leaving behind the formality of the throne room for something far more personal, the silent communion. Unlike the public ceremonies, this ritual is for the king alone. It is not meant to be shared, not meant to be observed. There are no witnesses, no advisors at his side. Just the moonlight, the stone, and the weight of his thoughts. The silent communion is a moment where the king confronts the decisions he's made, the choices yet to come, and the solitude of power. It is said that this is where the real king exists beneath the crown, beneath the responsibilities of leadership, where only silence and reflection remain. An unusual aspect of this communion is its setting. The king makes his way to a quiet corner of the royal gardens, far from the bustling courtiers and the noise of the court. There, he kneels beside a small stone altar, a simple structure surrounded by ancient trees and flowering shrubs that seem to listen as much as the king himself does. It is in this place that the king places his crown, his scepter, and his royal attire, leaving them behind as he enters this moment of solitude. This is not a prayer, nor is it a formal ritual. It is a return to something deeper, an act of self-reckoning. The king sits on the cold stone, closing his eyes and letting the silence envelop him. In these moments, the weight of the crown is not just physical but existential. For once, the king is not a ruler, but a man, searching for clarity in the quiet darkness. Historians have long debated the significance of these moments. Some claim it is the king's way of staying grounded, of reconnecting with the mortal world beyond the throne. Others argue that it is a necessary act of renewal, an opportunity for the king to regain his sense of direction in a court that constantly demands more. But the truth is, no one truly knows the depth of these silent communions, because they are his alone. The king has never shared them with anyone, not even his closest advisors. One curious detail: when the king returns from the silent communion, he is always different, more at ease, more focused, more aware of the intricacies of his kingdom. The courtiers notice the subtle shift in his demeanor, but they do not question it. It is simply understood that these moments of reflection give the king the clarity he needs to rule. It is as though, in the absence of others' voices, he can hear his own more clearly. The silent communion is always concluded with a simple act. The king stands, dusts the dirt from his knees, and walks back to the castle, where he reclaims his crown and his title. But in those moments alone in the garden, he is free of them, free of the roles that the court and the kingdom have carved for him. He is just a man, searching for the truth that lies beyond power. As you watch the king return to the castle, the garden behind him now quiet again, you can't help but wonder how many other rulers, surrounded by the noise of their courts, long for moments like these. Perhaps the greatest power lies not in what is given to the world, but in what is taken away from it. The solitude, the silence, the ability to listen to one's own thoughts without the weight of expectation. The king's communion has ended, but its effects will linger in the quiet of the night. For him, this act is as necessary as any royal decree. And for the kingdom, it is a reminder that even the strongest of rulers must sometimes step away from the throne to find the clarity they need to lead. The air in the royal kitchen is thick with the smell of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and the faintest hint of lavender. Tonight, the king has invited a special group of court chefs, herbalists, and culinary alchemists to partake in what has become a somewhat legendary event at court, the Feast of Secrets. It is not just a banquet, it is an experiment in indulgence and revelation, where each dish served carries not only flavor but meaning. The tradition of the feast dates back to the earliest days of the monarchy. It is said that the first king of this line, in a moment of both self-reflection and political shrewdness, created the event as a way of testing those who would sit at his table. Each dish served at the feast is crafted to reveal something about the person who eats it. Some call it a taste of loyalty, others a sacrifice of the senses, but the king has long believed that the ability to withstand the culinary challenges of the feast speaks to more than just appetite. It speaks to character, endurance, and, above all, trust. As you enter the kitchen, you are greeted by the sight of several long tables covered in ornate serving dishes, each one more intricate than the last. The chefs move with practiced precision, their hands creating and assembling delicate dishes that look more like works of art than food. The first course is placed on the table, a dish of chilled pheasant stuffed with honeyed almonds, garnished with golden threads of saffron and edible flowers. It is a dish meant to symbolize wealth and bounty, but also to test whether the guest can resist its decadence. Those who partake in it are often expected to display restraint, but many cannot. The rich sweetness of the pheasant calls to them, urging them to indulge beyond what is appropriate. The king enters the room, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He surveys the spread of dishes with a quiet sense of satisfaction. This night is not just about food. It is about testing the limits of control, of revealing which courtiers are truly loyal, and which might be swayed by indulgence. Each course represents a different trial, an experiment in self-discipline, in trust, and in the subtle politics of the court. Tonight's second course is even more elaborate, a delicate pastry made from the finest butter and flour, stuffed with a mix of fragrant herbs and meats from the royal game reserve. But it is the filling that holds the secret, a rare herb, said to have a calming effect on the nerves. The king knows that some guests will feel a strange relaxation as they eat, and he watches their reactions closely. It is not just the flavor that matters, it is how they respond. Do they feel themselves loosening their grip on restraint? Do they reveal too much when their guard is down? One curious feature of this feast is that the king himself never partakes in the dishes. He watches, observing how each of his guests eats, how they interact with each course. In this, he has created a subtle form of espionage by presenting these carefully crafted dishes. He is also presenting opportunities for his courtiers to reveal their true selves. Who can control their desires? Who will indulge? The king keeps a mental ledger of every reaction, every choice made, every hesitation. A strange ritual accompanies each course. Before the dish is served, the chefs explain the dish's symbolism to the court. Tonight, the pastry is described as a shield of restraint and a test of hidden desires. When the courtiers are told this, you can see some of them stiffen, as though the weight of the metaphor has reached their subconscious. They now know that eating is not just about taste, it is about revealing who they are beneath the surface. As the feast continues, the king's eyes flicker with a quiet amusement. He watches a young noble eagerly devour the pastry, his expression one of pure delight. But when the pastry is finished, the young noble's eyes dart to the others at the table, almost as if he is searching for some reassurance, some acknowledgement that his indulgence has not been noticed. The king makes a mental note, knowing that the young noble's desire to fit in, to appear loyal and controlled, has just cost him some measure of trust. The final dish of the night is a simple one, deceptively so, a bowl of water infused with a single rose petal. The rose, the king explains, symbolizes truth. The act of drinking the water, he says, will cleanse the soul, washing away the secrets that linger in the heart. It is a test of honesty, not of words, but of actions. The king watches as each noble sips from their bowl, noting the way their eyes shift, the way their lips curl. Does the rose symbolize purity, or does it evoke something darker, guilt, perhaps, or shame? As the last course is consumed, the king stands, his gaze sweeping across the table. The feast of secrets is over, but its revelations will remain. There is no need for direct confrontation. The guests have already revealed themselves through the choices they made, the way they responded to the food. The king smiles quietly to himself, knowing that this night, like all others, has been a success. In this court, where every gesture is scrutinized, even the smallest indulgence carries weight. The game of power is played through taste, through restraint, through the very act of eating. As the courtiers leave the kitchen, their movements slightly slower from the indulgence, you realize something. In this kingdom, even food is a weapon, a tool of manipulation, and the king has used it masterfully. The light is dim in the royal observatory, a small space hidden high above the castle, away from the distractions of court life. Tonight, the king has invited his most trusted astronomer and a select few scholars to witness a rare celestial event, the crossing of the twin moons, an occurrence that, according to legend, signals a time of great change. The mood is expectant, filled with the quiet tension of the unknown. In medieval courts, such events were often seen as omens, messages from the heavens. A king who could interpret the stars, who could read the will of the heavens, would be seen as a ruler not only of land, but of fate itself. Tonight's event, however, seems different. There is no grand speech, no ceremonial decree. The king has simply invited those closest to him to witness the celestial alignment, an act of humility perhaps, or a recognition that even a king must listen to forces beyond his control. The astronomer stands near the great telescope, his eyes fixed on the stars, adjusting the lenses with careful precision. The room is filled with the quiet sounds of this delicate work, the soft scraping of metal on metal, the faint creak of the floorboards as the king moves closer. The scholars and courtiers are seated in a loose circle, their faces bathed in the pale light of the twin moons that slowly begin to rise. The air is thick with anticipation, the weight of centuries of superstition hanging over the gathering. An unusual aspect of this court's interpretation of celestial events is that the king has always viewed them not as signs of divine approval or disfavor, but as a reflection of the balance of power. A rare event like this crossing of the moons is not just a wonder to behold, it is a signal that the balance of the realm may be shifting. The king understands this. He has always believed that the heavens are not simply above him, they are within him, part of the delicate dance between power, fate, and destiny. The astronomer speaks quietly, almost reverently, as he adjusts the telescope once more. When the moons cross, he explains, it is said that time itself bends. This is the moment when the fate of rulers is shaped not by their will, but by forces older than any kingdom. His voice trembles slightly, though no one speaks to acknowledge it. The king listens intently, his gaze fixed on the stars. He does not ask questions. He simply watches, waits. As the moons slowly align, a hush falls over the room. The scholars lean in, their eyes fixed on the telescope, as though the future itself is contained in the shifting light of the twin moons. The king remains standing, his posture erect but calm. In this moment, he is not a monarch issuing commands or a ruler making decrees. He is simply a man standing before the universe, acknowledging the vastness and unpredictability of what lies beyond the castle walls. Historians often speak of these moments in terms of divine right and the king's connection to the heavens. Some claim that it is in these very moments of cosmic alignment that a ruler gains insight into his future, that the stars guide his path. Others suggest that the king's actions during such times are mere posturing, a way of asserting his belief that even the heavens must bend to his will. But in this court, where power is never simple, the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. As the last of the alignment passes, the astronomer lowers the telescope and steps back. The room is quiet, and for a long moment, no one speaks. The king is the first to break the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. The stars have not changed, but we must now look to our actions, not to the heavens, he says quietly. The future is not written in the sky. It is written by those who choose to act. The guests in the room nod, though none speaks. They have all witnessed something profound, something beyond their control. But the king's words carry weight. In this court, the belief that the heavens guide the ruler is not just superstition. It is a tool, a way to remind his subjects that fate is as much a part of power as any sword or crown. As the guests begin to leave, their movements slow and thoughtful, you realize that the king, in this quiet moment of reflection, has once again shown his mastery over both the practical and the symbolic. He may not have read the stars in the way his astronomers do, but he understands their power. He understands that the illusion of fate can be just as powerful as the reality of it. The celestial event may have ended, but the king's control over the perception of his destiny lingers in the room, just as the moon's glow lingers in the sky. And in that lingering there is a quiet understanding that the king's rule is not just shaped by the forces of the stars, but by his ability to shape those very forces in the minds of his people. The royal chambers are alive with light tonight, their heavy tapestries shimmering in the warm glow of 1,000 candles. The usual hum of courtly politics has taken a backseat to something far more intimate, the performance of love. This is not the kind of love that is displayed in public spectacles, but the quiet, intricate kind that exists behind the closed doors of the castle's most private spaces. Tonight, the king has invited his closest confidant, a trusted advisor who has served at his side for many years, to witness the personal side of leadership. The advisor has long been a key figure in the king's strategy, offering counsel on everything from diplomacy to military tactics. But tonight, their conversation will not revolve around politics. Tonight, it will revolve around the softer power, the kind of connection that binds a ruler to his kingdom through more than just decrees and laws. The custom of the performance of love is a deeply personal one, though it is not often spoken of openly. The king, unlike many of his predecessors, understands that true power comes not only from ruling with strength, but from knowing how to inspire loyalty and affection in those who serve him. The ritual involves sharing moments of vulnerability, of revealing the king's own emotional landscape in a way that allows those around him to see the man behind the crown. The first part of the ritual is simple. The king steps into a room filled with fragrant flowers, roses, lilacs, and jasmine, where he is joined by his confidant. The scent is thick in the air, wrapping around them like a cloak. The king does not immediately speak, but simply watches the flowers, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. His silence is intentional, a way to create space for reflection and connection. As the confidant waits in respectful silence, the king begins to speak softly, recounting moments from his youth, his earliest days as a prince, his first lessons in leadership, the trials he faced as he ascended to the throne. These moments are not grand speeches or heroic tales, but small, personal stories that reveal the man behind the crown. The confidante listens intently, offering only quiet nods, his presence a steady source of support. The next part of the ritual involves the sharing of a single object, an item that represents something deeply personal to the king. It could be a letter from his mother, a gift from his first love, or a small token from his first battle. The king places the object in the confidant's hands, allowing him to hold it for a moment, to feel the weight of it. This exchange is symbolic, a way of showing that power is not only held in the crown or in the law, but in the personal connections that bind a ruler to those he trusts most. An unusual aspect of this ritual is that the confidant is not expected to speak immediately. The king watches, gauging his reaction, noting how the object resonates with the confidant. This moment of silence allows the king to see his trusted ally through a different lens, not just as an advisor, but as a person, someone who shares in the emotional weight of leadership. Some claim that this ritual is simply an emotional exercise, a way for the king to soften the harsh edges of his power. Others believe that it serves a deeper purpose, that by sharing his most intimate moments, the king is reminding himself of the humanity that lies at the heart of his rule. It is a reminder that, despite the crown he wears, he is still human, capable of love, loss, and vulnerability. As the ritual concludes, the king and his confidant stand together in the stillness of the room, the candles flickering softly. There are no grand gestures, no speeches. Instead, the two of them share a quiet understanding, a connection forged in shared vulnerability. The confidant gently returns the object to the king, who smiles a rare, genuine smile that speaks of trust and camaraderie. Historians often overlook the quieter rituals of a king's reign, focusing instead on the battles won, the treaties signed, and the alliances forged. But in this quiet room, surrounded by flowers and soft light, the king has reminded us that the true strength of a ruler lies not in his ability to command, but in his ability to connect with those he leads through love, trust, and shared experience. As the king leaves the room, his confidant follows quietly behind him, both of them changed by the evening's quiet exchange. The power of the crown is not just in what is seen, it is in what is felt. And tonight, the king has shown that the heart of a ruler is just as important as the might of his reign. The early morning fog hangs heavy over the castle grounds, softening the edges of everything it touches. The cool air carries with it the scent of wet earth and damp stone, a reminder of nature's quiet persistence. Inside the castle, the royal chambers are dimly lit by the early morning light, casting long shadows on the walls. The king stands by the window, his gaze distant, lost in thought. Tonight, he has invited a select group of advisors for an unusual gathering, the Council of Reflection. Unlike the usual council meetings, which revolve around immediate issues of state, this gathering is about introspection. The king has called his closest confidants together not to discuss treaties, war plans, or alliances, but to reflect on the state of the kingdom and on their own roles within it. It is a practice the king has maintained for years, though few understand its true purpose. The room is quiet as the advisors file in, each one taking their seat around a large, circular table. The king gestures for them to remain silent for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. This is not a time for strategy or discussion. This is a time for each person in the room to look inward and consider the impact of their actions on the kingdom. An unusual aspect of this council is that the king has requested that no notes be taken, no plans written down. This is not a formal session, it is a gathering meant to foster candidness, to strip away the usual formalities and see where each of them stands. The king's role tonight is not to dictate or advise, but to listen to understand how each of his advisors sees their place within the kingdom's greater narrative. The first to speak is a seasoned diplomat, known for his shrewd mind and calm demeanor. He begins not with a report or a suggestion, but with a simple question. What have I done to serve the people, to serve the king? The question hangs in the air, drawing silence from the room. This is not a question of politics, but of purpose. The diplomat's words are carefully measured, his eyes searching for something deeper than the usual answers he provides in council. The king listens intently, his eyes never leaving the diplomat. It is a long, uncomfortable silence before the diplomat continues. I have brokered peace, negotiated terms. But have I served the true needs of the kingdom? Have I done enough to bring harmony to those beyond the walls of the court? It is a rare moment of vulnerability, especially from someone so accustomed to diplomacy and careful words. The room is still, each advisor reflecting on their own actions, their own contributions, or perhaps their lack thereof. The next to speak is a military strategist, her posture proud but her voice tinged with uncertainty. She, too, begins with a question. How many battles have we fought for the throne, and how many battles have we fought for the people? Her words are a challenge, a reminder that the king's power is not just secured by armies, but by the loyalty of the people. The strategist's gaze is steady, but there is a flicker of doubt in her eyes, as if she too is searching for answers that have eluded her. One by one, the advisors speak, not of strategies or plans, but of the deeper questions that govern their roles in the kingdom. What are their true motivations? What have they done to serve the king, to serve the realm, and to serve themselves? Each confession, each admission of uncertainty, is a reminder that even those who sit at the king's side are, at their core, human. The king remains silent throughout, offering no answers, no guidance. He is not here to provide solutions, but to listen and to reflect with them. This, too, is a subtle display of power. In a kingdom where words are often weighed with consequence, the king's ability to listen without interruption is a rare gift. At the close of the gathering, the king speaks for the first time, his voice low and contemplative. "We are not perfect," he says, his words simple but carrying the weight of the evening's reflections. "But we are bound by duty to each other and to the kingdom. And that duty requires us to look inward, to ask ourselves what we have done to serve those who need us most." The advisors leave the council chamber quietly, their steps slow, each one lost in thought. The king remains behind, standing by the window once more, his gaze turned outward, toward the fog that still clings to the castle grounds. In the stillness, the castle feels both vast and intimate, a place where power and responsibility, loyalty and doubt, coexist in a delicate balance. For the king, tonight's council was not about making decisions or laying plans. It was about reminding his advisors and himself that the greatest strength of a ruler lies not in their ability to command, but in their ability to reflect, to learn, and to grow. And perhaps, in the end, it is this quiet, introspective power that makes him a ruler worth following. The night is dark, with only the soft light of lanterns casting shadows across the castle's outer courtyard. The king stands at the balcony overlooking the grand expanse, the wind tugging at his cloak, as though calling him to witness what lies beyond the castle walls. Tonight is the final council, but unlike the others, this gathering will be his last as the kingdom's ruler. The time for reflection has passed. Now, the moment to decide who will follow him, who will carry the weight of leadership forward, is upon him. This council is not about policies or strategies. The king has made his decisions long ago, but the time has come to entrust the realm to his chosen successor. Those gathered here are not mere advisors. They are the heart of the court, the ones who have stood by the king through thick and thin. It is for them, and for the kingdom, that he must now pass the mantle of power. The unusual aspect of this council is its brevity. There is no grand speech, no long discussion. The king does not wish to be seen as someone who has outstayed his time, but rather as one who recognizes when it is time to step aside. He has invited the court's most trusted members, his most loyal subjects, to witness the moment when he chooses his heir, a moment that will determine the future of the kingdom. The room is filled with a mix of tension and anticipation. The king walks slowly to the center, his eyes scanning the faces of those who have been with him for so many years. The first to speak is the eldest of his advisors, a man who has served faithfully for decades. His voice is steady, but his eyes betray a hint of sorrow, for he knows the weight of what is about to happen. "Your Majesty, you have led us through trials and triumphs, but now, the time has come for your wisdom to guide the future of the realm." The king nods, acknowledging the sentiment, but he knows that words cannot capture the depth of what this moment means. The kingdom has seen many rulers, but none like him. His reign has been one of careful balance, of weaving power and responsibility together, of knowing when to wield authority and when to let others have their say. And yet, as he stands at this crossroads, the weight of leadership feels lighter than it ever has. One by one, the council members offer their thoughts, speaking of the king's legacy, his unwavering commitment to the realm, and his ability to see beyond the immediate horizon. But each of them also knows that their words are not what will guide the king's decision. The decision will come from within him, from his understanding of the kingdom's future, and from the trust he has built with those who will carry the kingdom forward. When it is his turn to speak, the king's voice is calm, but there is a depth in it that speaks of years of leadership. "I have led this kingdom with a steady hand," he begins, his words deliberate. "But a ruler's true strength lies not in the power they hold, but in the strength of those who follow them. Tonight, I pass that strength on to another." The room is still. The king pauses, his gaze resting on each person in the room, each one of them who has stood by his side. "The successor," he continues, "will not be one who mimics my reign, but one who shapes their own path, guided by the same principles of justice and wisdom that have shaped this kingdom. It is time for the kingdom to evolve, to grow in new ways." There is a murmur of agreement, but no one speaks until the king gestures toward the youngest member of the council, a woman who has shown exceptional promise in her role, yet who has never been openly considered for the throne. She is the king's choice, the one he believes will guide the kingdom into the future, while keeping the traditions of the past intact. The moment is almost surreal, as the king reaches forward and places his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that speaks of trust and recognition. "You have earned this," he says quietly. "The kingdom is yours now." The court falls into stunned silence. The woman, though young, rises with a sense of grace and resolve, the weight of the moment settling upon her. She steps forward, her eyes meeting the king's, and for a brief moment there is an unspoken understanding between them. She is ready, and the kingdom will follow her. As the council concludes, the king steps back, allowing the new ruler to take center stage. There is no fanfare, no trumpet sound to announce the transition. The moment feels more like a quiet passing of the torch, a change that has been building for years, and yet still feels like the beginning of something new. The king watches from the shadows, his final act of leadership not in command, but in quiet surrender. He knows the time has come for the kingdom to flourish under new hands, and that the strength of his reign lies in his ability to recognize when to step aside. The final council is over, but its ripples will be felt for generations to come. In the calmness of the moment, the king's true legacy is revealed not in his power, but in his wisdom and his ability to guide the kingdom into the future.